He signed the papers at 11:47 p.m. Cassian Rourke didn't look at her when he did it. Kept his eyes on the document, on the clean black line of his own signature, and he told himself what he had been telling himself for weeks, that this was the right move, the necessary move, the move a man like him should have made years ago. He clicked the pen closed and set it on the edge of the table like it was a period at the end of a sentence he was finished with. Lena Vale picked it up. She signed her own name beneath his. Her handwriting was small and even, and she didn't rush it. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything at all. That was what he remembered later. How she didn't say a single word. Cassian stood up from the table first. His attorney was already moving papers into a leather case. The room was one of the private conference rooms on the 41st floor of the Rourke building, and it smelled like recycled air and expensive carpet cleaner. And Cassian had been in this room 100 times, but never once felt how small it was until that moment, standing there with the divorce finalized and Lena still seated, her hands folded on the table in front of her like she was waiting for a bus. "You understand what you've received," his attorney said to her. Not a question. A confirmation of something already settled. "I understand," Lena said. Cassian looked at her then. Really looked at her, for maybe the third time in 6 years. She was 31 years old, and she looked exactly the same as the day he married her in a closed ceremony with 11 people present and no press, because he had needed a wife for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with optics, and a particular deal with a particular family who valued the appearance of stability. She was slight and pale, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that made her look like a woman who spent her days organizing filing cabinets. Coat was from a department store. Her shoes had scuff marks on the left toe. Cassian had told Marcus, his right hand, 6 months ago, that he sometimes forgot she lived in the same house. Marcus had laughed. That's either a good thing or a very bad one. Cassian hadn't asked what he meant. Now Lena pushed her chair back and stood and gathered the single manila folder she had brought with her, just the one folder. No legal team, no demands, no counteroffers, and she nodded to his attorney with something that almost looked like courtesy, and then she looked at Cassian. "I hope you get what you're looking for," she said. He didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that. She walked to the door, and he watched her go, and he felt something shift in his chest, something small and unnamed. And he dismissed it immediately because he was Cassian Rourke, and he had not survived 38 years in the most violent business on the eastern seaboard by paying attention to unnamed feelings. The elevator doors closed behind her. His attorney was saying something about the asset transfer timeline, and Cass turned back to the window and looked out at the city below, all that black water and light. And he thought, it's done. 6 years of a marriage that served its purpose and then ran past its expiration date. Lena was quiet and dutiful and completely unremarkable, and that had been useful once, but his world had changed. And he needed something different now, a presence, not a shadow. He had already told Marcus to begin arrangements. He had not told Lena. She had simply received the papers 3 weeks ago and signed them without a single phone call. That should have told him something. He was still at the window when the first headlights appeared at the building's main gate below. He almost didn't notice it. One vehicle was nothing. The building had overnight staff, deliveries, security rotations. Then there was a second vehicle behind the first, and then a third pulling in behind that, and then the line of them kept coming, black sedans with no plates visible from this height, and something in Cassian's body went cold before his brain caught up to why. Counted. He reached 10 and kept going. 30 vehicles. 32, maybe more. They parked in a formation that wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was practiced. These were people who knew how to position them in a space for maximum effect, and Cassian knew that because he employed people exactly like them, and he recognized the choreography of controlled power when he saw it. His phone rang. It was the building's head of security. The man's voice had something in it that Cassian had never heard there before. "You need to come down." "Who are they?" A pause. A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. "Sir, they're identifying themselves as the Marlo family." The room got very quiet. Cassian set the phone down on the conference table without ending the call. He looked at his attorney. His attorney had gone the color of old paper. The Marlo family. There were names in Cassian's world that carried weight the way the weather carried pressure. You felt them before they arrived, felt the air change, felt something in your spine register what your eyes hadn't seen yet. The Marlos were not a name. They were a condition. They were the reason that 6 different criminal organizations across 3 countries paid tribute on a quarterly schedule without being asked twice. They were the reason that 2 federal task forces had been disbanded after their key witnesses developed selective amnesia. They were the reason that when old men in this business told stories about power, they lowered their voices even inside locked rooms. Cassian had never met a Marlo face to face. In 18 years of building his empire, he had gotten close once, been in the same city once, and had still felt the distance between their brains like standing at the bottom of something very tall and looking up. He was moving before he decided to move, down the elevator, through the lobby, past his own security team who were standing at the glass entrance, with the particular stillness of men who had assessed the situation outside and concluded that the correct posture was to not escalate anything. Cassian pushed through the doors. The rain had started while he was upstairs. Came down in thin cold needles, and it hit the pavement and the rooftops of 30-odd black vehicles and the shoulders of the people standing between them. And there were a lot of people, and they were all very still. Lena was at the bottom of the building's front step. She was standing in the rain without an umbrella, and her department store coat was getting wet, and she was looking at the man who had just walked out of the lead vehicle. And Cassian recognized him the way you recognize a face from a photograph you've studied, without knowing why. The broad shoulders, the white hair, the way the man moved, like someone who had never once in his life been required to hurry. Emilio Marlo, who was 71 years old, who had buried 4 rivals and 2 federal prosecutors and outlasted every attempt to contain him across 5 decades, who had a voice like gravel wrapped in silk, and who was, by every account Cassian had ever received, a man who knelt for nothing and no one. He walked across the wet pavement toward Lena. His men moved with him, and then stopped when he stopped, 3 feet from her, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression Cassian could not read from where he stood. And then Emilio Marlo removed his coat from his own shoulders, a long black coat, wool, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he placed it around Lena's. And then he went down on one knee, on the wet pavement of the Rourke Building's entrance plaza, in the rain, in front of 30-something witnesses. And he bowed his head. "Forgive us, Mrs. Vale," Emilio Marlo said, "for the years we left you unprotected." Cassian stopped breathing. He counted 4 seconds of complete silence, the only sounds the rain and the distant city, before Lena reached out and placed her hand briefly on the old man's shoulder and said something too quiet for Cassian to hear. Whatever she said, Emilio Marlo rose. And every person who had come out of those 30 vehicles, men and women in dark coats, people who, by their posture and their stillness, were not employees but principals, people who commanded, dipped their heads, not to Cassian Rourke, to the woman standing in front of him in a scuffed pair of shoes. Lena turned. She looked at Cassian across 15 feet of wet pavement, and her expression was exactly the same as it had been. In the conference room, quiet, still, not angry and not satisfied, just present, just looking at him with those dark eyes that he suddenly realized he had no idea how to read. "You should go back inside," she said. "You're not dressed for rain." Cassian didn't move. "Lena." His voice came out differently than he expected, smaller somehow. "What is this?" She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to Emilio Marlo and said something, and Emilio glanced at Cassian with an expression that was not contempt exactly, but adjacent to it. And then 2 of his people moved to open the rear door of the lead sedan, and Lena walked toward it. "Wait." Cassian came down the steps. 3 of the Marlo people shifted without moving toward him, just shifted, repositioned, made their physical presence understood. He stopped. "Lena, wait." She paused with her hand on the car door and looked back at him over her shoulder. "Papers are signed," she said. "It's finished. Who are these people?" And for the first time all evening, something moved across her face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something older than that, something wearier, and it lasted only a moment before her face settled back into that careful stillness. "People who know what I'm worth," she said. She got into the car. The door closed. The motorcade moved, precise and unhurried, back through the building gate and into the city rain, and Cassian stood on the wet pavement and watched it go and felt the specific cold of a man who has just realized that the ground under his feet is not where he thought it was. He didn't sleep. He had a security debrief at 2 in the morning. 3 of his senior people seated around the conference table while rain tracked down the windows, and he sat at the head of it and listened to what they had managed to find in the space of 2 hours, which was not much, and what little there was landed in his chest like something dropped from a height. The Marlo family did not make public gestures. This was known. They communicated through intermediaries and silence, and the particular kind of pressure that left no fingerprints. For Emilio Marlo to appear in person in the rain, on camera, outside a building with Cassian Rourke's name on it was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. It was a declaration of a kind that Cassian's people were still trying to decode. They called her Mrs. Vale, said Petra, his intelligence analyst. She was 34. And she had a way of presenting information that made it feel inevitable, which Cassian usually appreciated and currently found unbearable. Not Mrs. Rourke, Vale. That's her maiden name. Her legal name was Rourke for 6 years. What's your point? Petra looked at him with the careful expression of someone choosing their next words. Precisely. Point is that either they knew her before you married her, which means there's a history you weren't told about, or they deliberately chose to call her by the name she was using before you, which is its own kind of statement. Cassian looked at the table. Run everything we have on the name Vale, he said. Full genealogy. Every public record. Every property record. Every minus. I already started, Petra said. That's what I need to tell you. The name Vale doesn't have much publicly attached to it, but the family structure it maps to, when you go back 2 generations. She stopped. Say it. It maps to Marlo, she said. Not directly. Through a maternal line. The name was changed. The records were they weren't destroyed, but they were buried deep enough that you wouldn't find them unless you were specifically looking. Conference room was very quiet. Lena is a Marlo, Cassian said. Not a question, testing how the words felt in his mouth and finding that they didn't fit, that his brain was refusing to accommodate the shape of it. Collateral line, Petra said. Not direct descent from Emilio's branch, but from what I can piece together in the last 2 hours, her mother was Emilio's younger sister, which makes Lena his niece. A pause. His only niece. The family's only female heir in that generation. Cassian pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window. Below, the city was wet and glittering and looked exactly the same as it always did, which felt wrong, somehow. Felt like the city should have the decency to look different, given that the last 2 hours had reorganized everything he thought he understood. She hid it, he said. She built an entirely separate identity, Petra said. Clean records, clean history. Went to college under Vale, worked under Vale, married you under Vale. If she hadn't married into your world, there might never have been a reason to look. Why would she do that? Petra was quiet for a moment. I don't know. That's the part I don't have yet. Cassian thought about the conference room upstairs. Scuffed shoes. The single manila folder. 6 years of a woman who moved through his house like a quiet draft of air, who made no demands, who attended the functions she was asked to attend, and dressed correctly, and said the right things, and then came home, and disappeared into the parts of the house he didn't think about. 6 years of that, and he had never once wondered what was underneath it. Marcus had tried to tell him something once. Not directly, Marcus never did anything directly. It wasn't his style, but there had been a moment, maybe 18 months ago, when Cassian had been deep in a problem with the Severin family, financial dispute that had been threatening to become something uglier, and the problem had resolved itself suddenly and cleanly, in a way that his own people couldn't irely account for. The Severin claim had simply evaporated. The documentation they had been using to press the dispute had been exposed as fabricated, and the intermediary who had presented it had quietly left the country. Marcus had come to him with the resolution, and his face had done something a flicker, brief and controlled, and he had said, "We got lucky on that one." And Cassian had accepted it, because the outcome was what he wanted, and he hadn't thought about the mechanism. He thought about it now. He went back to the table and sat down. I need everything. financial records, communications, the Severin situation, the problem with the northern ports 8 months ago, the one that should have cost us the distribution contract and didn't. He looked at Petra. All the problems that resolve themselves. Go back as far as you need to. Petra looked at him with that careful expression again. You think she was involved, I think, Cassian said slowly, that I have been very stupid for a very long time. He dismissed the meeting at 3:15. He sat alone in the conference room until 4 and looked at nothing and thought about the woman who had just signed her name under his and walked out of his life with a single manila folder and 30 armed vehicles waiting for her in the rain. There was a particular kind of anger that lived below fury, quieter and more corrosive, and Cassian knew it well because he had spent his whole life using it as fuel. It wasn't hot. It didn't make you do stupid things immediately. It sat in the chest and it waited and it asked questions. The question it was asking now was, how did she do it? Not why. He would get to why. But first, how? How did a woman who seemed, to every person in his orbit, to be nothing more than a quiet presence in his peripheral vision, operate anything? How did she move resources, pull strings, neutralize threats, do it all from inside a marriage to a man who prided himself on knowing everything that moved within his empire? The answer arrived in his mind with the specific clarity of something that had always been true and only needed the right angle to be visible. Because he had never once looked at her. He had looked at her and seen what he expected to see, a convenient wife, a functional arrangement, a woman who didn't make noise, and so he had stopped seeing her at all. She had used his own dismissal of her as cover. She had been invisible because he had made her invisible, and she had done her work inside that invisibility, and he had taken the results of that work and credited them to luck and to his own competence, and to the competence of people like Marcus and Petra. He sat with that for a long time. At 4:30, Petra called him back. I found the asset structure, she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. The divorce settlement, the numbers. Tell me. The properties that transferred to Lena's name in the settlement, the ones your legal team processed as standard marital assets. A pause. They're not standard. The way they're structured, the corporate layering, the trust arrangements, Cassian, she's been building this for at least 3 years. These aren't assets she received. They're assets she created. Legally, they're in a protected trust that your creditors can't touch and your enemies can't access, and the way the ownership is documented. They trace back to her, Cassian said. They trace back to a holding company that was incorporated under the Vale family interests, Petra said, which technically makes them, and this is the part where I need you to stay calm. I'm calm. Technically makes them Marlo-adjacent assets that your operation has been running on for 3 years. Another pause, which means you've been operating, in part, on money that traces back to the most powerful crime family on the eastern seaboard, and you didn't know it. And if any of your rivals had found that connection, before she structured it correctly, they could have used it to claim you were Marlo property. Cassian was quiet. But they didn't find it, he said. No, because she structured it correctly. Petra said it like that, flat and declarative. She built you a protection you didn't know you needed in a way that kept you from knowing you needed it, so that you couldn't accidentally compromise it by acting on it. He hung up without saying goodbye. He stood at the window and watched the city go from black to gray as the sun started somewhere behind the clouds. And he thought about 6 years, and he thought about the conference room, and the scuffed shoes, and the single manila folder, and he thought about Lena's face when she looked at him over her shoulder before getting into the car. People who know what I'm worth. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He had signed divorce papers at 11:47 p.m. He had believed when he did it that he was ending something that no longer served him. What he had ended, he was beginning to understand, was the only thing that had been keeping him standing. By noon, 2 things had happened. First, word had reached his organization that Cassian Rourke's marriage was over and that his wife had left with Marlo backing. In his world, information like that moved the way. Fire moved fast and in every direction at once. By the time Cassian was aware it was spreading, it had already been through 3 layers of the underground network and landed in the ears of people who were not his friends. The second, Marcus Vane came to him with the quarterly numbers. Marcus was 44, lean in the way of men who never stopped moving, and he had been Cassian's right hand for 11 years. He had a face that defaulted to competence, an expression that said he had already thought of the 3 angles you hadn't, and was being patient about it. Cassian had trusted him. You trusted a structural wall completely and without examination, because the examination never felt necessary. Read the numbers on the conference table and walked Cassian through the quarterly projections, and Cassian listened and watched Marcus's hands and thought about 3 years of asset transfers and thinking about invisible structures, and he asked at the end one question. The Severin situation, 18 months ago, what actually happened? Marcus didn't blink. The documentation was forged. We caught it. We caught it, Cassian repeated. Who specifically? Financial team, I believe. Petra's people. I asked Petra this morning. She said she doesn't have clear records of who flagged it. Marcus's expression didn't change. That was the thing about it. It genuinely didn't change. And that, Cassian understood in this moment, was not composure. That was practice. Records from that long ago get incomplete. You know how it is. I know how it is, Cassian agreed. He looked at the numbers on the table. What do you know about the Marlo family, Marcus? Pause. Half a second, maybe less. What I know about them is what everyone knows. They're not a group you want attention from. Last night, they came to my building and knelt in front of my ex-wife. I heard Marcus's voice was smooth. Strange business. She must have had a connection nobody knew about. Nobody knew about, Cassian said. Apparently not. Cassian nodded slowly. He looked at the numbers for another moment, and then he looked up at Marcus, and he let his face do the thing it did. When he wanted people to believe he was satisfied with an answer, and Marcus's expression relaxed by precisely the small amount that told Cassian that Marcus had been waiting for that relaxation and was relieved to see it. Get me the full records on the Northern Ports situation, Cassian said. 8 months ago. I want everything, of course, Marcus said. By end of day, he gathered his papers and he left, and Cassian sat with his hands flat on the conference table and stared at the door after it closed. And what he felt was not anger. It was colder than anger. It was the specific temperature of understanding something that you very much wish you had understood sooner. And the question now was not what it meant, but how far it went, and whether there was still time to find out before the people who had been waiting for exactly this vulnerability decided that the moment had arrived. His phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. He picked up, silence on the line, and then Lena's voice, quiet as ever, saying, "Don't trust the numbers he just showed you." Call ended before he could speak. Cassian set the phone down. Outside, the city went about its business in the gray afternoon light, entirely indifferent, and Cassian sat very still and understood that the woman he had spent 6 years not seeing had spent those same 6 years, seeing everything. Cassian sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after the call ended. The conference room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, the kind that had weight to it, and that pressed against the ears. He set the phone on the table face down and looked at the door. Marcus had walked through, and he thought about 11 years. 11 years of Marcus Vane at his right hand. 11 years of Marcus in every room where decisions were made, present for every meeting where vulnerabilities were named, every conversation where the architecture of Cassian's empire was discussed with the specificity that only trusted people were allowed to hear. 11 years. He picked the phone back up and dialed Petra. She answered on the second ring. I was about to call you. The numbers Marcus just showed me. I know. Her voice had that controlled quality that meant she was working to keep it controlled. I've been looking at the quarterly projections since last night, and there are problems, Cassian. The distributions in the Northern account don't match what I have on record from 8 weeks ago. The gap isn't huge, but it's not nothing either. Somewhere between 4 and 6% has been redirected, and when I try to trace where it went, it disappears. It doesn't disappear. It's just the trail goes through 3 shell structures and then resolves into an account that was opened under a name I don't recognize. Someone did this carefully. This wasn't fast work. Cassian stood up from the table. He needed to move. He walked to the window and looked out at the city and made himself breathe evenly, made himself keep his hands unclenched. How long? Based on what I'm seeing, at least 14 months, maybe longer. 14 months. Before the Severin situation, before the northern ports, before all the problems that had resolved themselves in ways his own people couldn't account, for which he now understood were not his own people resolving them at all. I need you to pull everything, he said. Every transaction Marcus has touched, every account he has access to, every external contact he's logged. Don't go through the normal system. Use the offline archive. Pause. Cassian. If I do that and he finds out I'm looking, he won't find out today. Today I'm meeting with him at 3 to go over the northern ports records he's going to bring me. You told him to bring you those records. He'll bring me something that looks like those records. Another pause, longer. And you want to know what he changes. I want to know what he thinks I'll believe, Cassian said. He hung up. He stood at the window for another moment, and then he made one more call. This one, to a number he kept in his head rather than his phone, a number he had not dialed in almost 2 years. It rang 4 times, and then a voice answered that was dry and unhurried and female. I wondered when you'd call, Lena said. The number you used earlier. Disposable. Don't try to trace it. I wasn't going to trace it. He stopped. Tried again. The numbers Marcus showed me this morning. How bad is it? A silence that lasted long enough that Cassian felt it in his molars. How much do you want to know right now? Everything. You can't act on everything right now without tipping him off. So I'll tell you what you need for today. Her voice was the same as it had always been, quiet, precise, carrying no emotion that he could name. The Northern Ports records he brings you at 3 will show a 2-point gap, not the real gap, which is closer to 9. He's been moving money in 3-week intervals into an account that belongs to a man named Cole Druitt. Cole Druitt is a mid-level operator who works for the Seston Syndicate. The Seston Syndicate, a name that lived on the opposite side of the city from Cassian's operations. A name attached to a man called Jerome Seston, who had been trying to expand his territory for 3 years, and had not because Cassian's network had been too stable to crack through conventional pressure. He's been feeding Seston, Cassian said. It came out flat. He heard the flatness in his own voice. For 14 months, Lena said, not just money, information, organization structure, weak points in the supply chain, the identities of 3 people in your network who report directly to you and whose names are not public, a breath, and the particulars of your divorce settlement. Cassian's hand tightened on the phone. He gave them the settlement. He gave them the timeline, when the papers would be signed, when you would be legally separated from the Marlo connection, because they know what I am, Cassian. Seston's people know my family history. That's why this was engineered the way it was. Her voice stayed level. She delivered this the way a person delivers a weather report. Just information. Just fact. The divorce wasn't my idea. The divorce was suggested to you, gradually, over the course of about 8 months, by someone who made you feel like it was your own conclusion. The window in front of him showed the city going about its afternoon. Cassian looked at his own reflection in the glass, faint against the gray light, and he tried to remember the conversations, tried to trace the thread of how the decision had actually formed. Comments Marcus had made, casual and offhand, about optics, about the image of a man in Cassian's position, about the kind of presence a wife should have and didn't. He had thought he'd reached the conclusion himself. Lena. His voice came out differently than he intended. Lower. Did you know this was happening? The pause that followed was not long, but it was precise. I knew someone in your inner circle was compromised. I didn't know who for certain until 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. I needed to be sure. You don't accuse someone 11 years in without being sure. And when you were sure, I signed the divorce papers, she said. Because by then, I knew what the endgame was, and the endgame required me to be out of the picture. Not out of your life. Out of the picture they were building. Cassian turned from the window. He sat back down at the table because his legs had decided they were done, holding him up without complaint. They wanted you separated from me before they moved. They wanted me separated from my family's protection of your operation before they moved, she said. Those aren't quite the same thing. They weren't afraid of me as your wife. They were afraid of what my family would do if an operation under Marlo protection was hit while I was still inside it. So you divorced me. So that if something happened to you, It would look like a business matter between Cassian Rourke and Jerome Seston, not an attack on a Marlo-adjacent interest. A pause, which would have gotten you quietly managed and filed away, instead of triggering the kind of response that my family would bring. He sat with that for a moment, the mechanics of it assembling themselves in his head with horrible clarity. Lena divorcing him had not been Lena abandoning him. Lena divorcing him had been Lena deliberately removing herself from the blast radius, while simultaneously making the blast radius a great deal more dangerous for anyone who tried to light the fuse. She had protected him by leaving him, and she had done it without telling him, because telling him would have required trusting him with information that he might, in his anger or his pride, have mishandled. He wanted to be angry about that. He reached for the anger and found something else there, instead something that sat heavier and was harder to dismiss. "What do I do at 3 o'clock?" he said. "Take the records he brings. Look at them with exactly the face you'd make if you believed them. Ask 2 questions, the margin on the Eastern account and the timeline on the next distribution cycle. Those are questions where his answers will tell you how deep he thinks you're looking." A pause. "And don't let him see you look at your phone. Are you watching the building?" "I'm watching what matters," she said. And the call ended. Marcus arrived at 3:02, which was 2 minutes later than Marcus had ever arrived for anything in 11 years. And Cassian, who had spent the intervening hours reading a file that Petra had sent to his offline drive, noticed the 2 minutes and filed it away. The records Marcus brought were clean. They were beautifully clean, the kind of clean that took time to produce. And that time explained the 2 minutes. He spread them across the conference table and walked Cassian through them with the same steady competence he always projected. And the 2-point gap was exactly where Lena had said it would be, and the explanation Marcus offered for it was reasonable and detailed and documented in a way that would have satisfied Cassian completely 6 months ago. Cassian looked at the numbers, and he asked about the margin on the Eastern account. Marcus answered without hesitating. Cassian looked up at him. "That's not what Petra has in her records from last quarter." A half-second. A single half-second where Marcus's eyes did something small and quickly controlled. "There may have been a reconciliation I wasn't aware of. Can check with her." "Do that," Cassian said. He looked back at the numbers. "And the next distribution cycle. We're still on the 23rd? "The 23rd, yes." Cassian nodded and looked at the numbers a moment longer, and then looked up with the face he had been practicing. For 2 hours, the face of a man who was satisfied, who was tired and preoccupied and not digging for anything. "Good. Leave these with me." Marcus gathered his own copies, unhurried, and stood. Everything else looked solid, all things considered. "All things considered," Cassian agreed. Marcus paused at the door. "The business last night. The Marlos." He said it carefully, the way you say a word in a language you're not sure you're pronouncing correctly. "Have you made any decisions about how you're handling the public side of it?" "Still thinking," Cassian said. "Better to get in front of it. Perception matters right now." "It always matters," Cassian said. "Thanks, Marcus." He watched the door close. He sat for exactly 90 seconds, counting, and then he called Petra. He said, "The Eastern margin is clean," he said. "What do you have?" 7.5% below what it should be, Petra said immediately. "He knew you were going to ask." He had the answer ready. But he gave you a number that requires you to believe an adjustment was made, that nobody logged. "Nobody logged it," Cassian said, "because it didn't happen." "No," Petra said. "It didn't." Cassian hung up. He went to the window again. He was doing that a lot today, going to the window, as if the city below had answers, as if looking out at all those buildings and all those lives was going to resolve the specific and personal catastrophe assembling itself around him. He thought about the 23rd, the distribution cycle Marcus had confirmed. Whatever that date meant to Seston's people, Marcus had just confirmed it was still happening, which meant Marcus had just sent a signal. He needed more than Petra's records. He needed to know what the signal meant. He called Lena again, different number this time, but she answered the same way, like she'd been expecting it. "You caught the Eastern margin. He's confirmed something to Seston. 23rd. I know what the 23rd is." And, for the first time, her voice shifted, not a lot, just enough for Cassian to feel it, like a room temperature dropping 2 degrees. "That's when they're planning to move. On you. The city outside was the same city it always was. Cassian looked at it and absorbed what she had just said and worked to keep his breathing even. How Seston's been building a case. Documents, manufactured paper trails, evidence that ties you to 3 things you didn't do, including the Mercer incident. She paused. Those documents go to the right people. You don't go to prison because you're Cassian Rourke, and you don't go to prison easily. But your organization gets frozen. Your assets get scrutinized. And in that window, that 2 or 3 week window, while you're fighting the legal side, Seston moves into your territory and takes it. And Marcus gets paid. Marcus gets paid and gets relocated, she said. He has an exit arrangement. It's already in place. He's been building it for 8 months. 8 months. The same timeline as the divorce engineering. Cassian pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. How do you know all of this? A pause. Because I've been dismantling it, she said, piece by piece, for 6 weeks since I knew it was Marcus. Every document in Seston's file on you, I've been working through the sources. 3 of the 4 are already compromised. The 4th is the problem. Another pause, smaller. 4th requires access to Seston's internal archive, which I don't have yet. What happens if you don't get it by the 23rd? The document in that archive connects your name to the Mercer incident in a way that's going to be hard to argue against without evidence of how it was manufactured. And the person who manufactured it he's good, Cassian. He's better than most people I've dealt with. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Cassian was starting to learn to hear. A subterranean frequency that was the closest Lena Vale got to admitting that she was worried. I need 12 more days. You have 10. Then I need to move faster. Cassian turned from the window. He sat back at the table. He looked at Marcus's clean, beautiful, fraudulent numbers, and he felt the anger that lived below fury beginning to do something. Not burn hotter, but organize itself. Find shape. Become something usable. What do you need from me? Right now? Nothing. Don't change your behavior with Marcus. Don't look at him differently. Don't alter the distribution schedule. A breath. I know that's hard. It's hard, he agreed. I know. There was a silence between them that was different from the previous silences. It had texture. It had the particular quality of 2 people who had spent 6 years in the same house, not talking, and were now in the wreckage of what that silence had cost them, figuring out how to speak to each other like the stakes were what they were. Lena. He said her name and then stopped. Tried again. The assets. The trust. What you built. What about it? You didn't have to do that, I know. You spent 3 years protecting an operation, run by a man who didn't notice you were in the room. The silence that followed was 5 seconds long. I wasn't protecting the operation, she said. I was protecting you. Those aren't the same thing either. And then before he could answer, I have to go. Don't call this number again after tonight. The call ended. Cassian sat at the table with his hands flat on the cold surface and Marcus's falsified numbers in front of him and the particular weight of a man who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of his own failure. And it was not a comfortable weight, not a weight you adjusted to quickly, but it was clarifying in the way that only genuinely terrible realizations could be. Petra found the offshore account at 7:40 that evening. Came to him in person, which she only did when the information was too sensitive for any electronic channel, and she sat across from him in the conference room, with her laptop closed in front of her and her hands on top of it, and she said, "You need to hear this without reacting. Say it. The account Marcus has been feeding money into Cole Druitt's account. The Seston connection Druitt has been using it to pay 3 people inside our network, not operationally. These aren't people with access to the financial systems or the strategic planning." She paused. They're the people who watch you. Daily routines. Security rotation schedules. Which car you use. Which exits. Which routes. The room got very quiet. They've been building a physical picture, Cassian said. For 7 months. Petra's voice was flat and professional, and her hands on the laptop were perfectly still. The level of detail in what they've been compiling, Cassian, they know your patterns better than your own security team does. They know the 15-minute gap in the East Corridor rotation. They know which guard takes the early exit on Thursdays. They know you go to the 4th floor kitchen every night between 10 and 10:30 because you don't sleep well, and the coffee machine there is the one you prefer. Cassian looked at his hands on the table. The 23rd isn't just a legal move, he said. No, Petra said. It's not. The legal documents going to the right people would freeze his organization and create the chaos Seston needed to move into his territory. That part was still true. But now Cassian understood that the documents were not the primary weapon. They were the noise, the distraction, the thing that would have his people and his lawyers and his resources pointed in one direction, while something else came from another. They weren't planning to take his empire. They were planning to take him. Marcus knows, Cassian said. Marcus built it, Petra said. Cassian looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression he recognized, the expression of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have, staying professional out of discipline rather than comfort. Are you safe? He said. Does he know how much you know? I've been careful. A pause. But Cassian, if you move on him and it doesn't go cleanly, they'll know someone inside was looking. And then you become a problem they need to solve. He stood up. Who else knows what you've found? Nobody. Just you. Keep it that way. I'm going to need you to do one more thing. He looked at her. I need you to put together everything, every piece, every account, every transaction, every contact, and I need it in a format that can go to Lena Vale's people by tomorrow morning. Petra looked at him steadily. You're going to work with the Marlos. I'm going to work with Lena, Cassian said. The Marlos are just what comes with her. He was at the door when Petra said his name. He stopped. The 3 people Marcus has watching you, she said. One of them is someone you've had for 5 years. I don't want to tell you who it is over any channel. She looked at him. Be careful tonight. Cassian nodded once and walked out. The hallway was empty. The building was thinning out for the evening, skeleton crew settling in, and Cassian walked toward the elevator and thought about patterns, about the east corridor rotation, and the Thursday guard in the 4th floor kitchen, and the coffee machine he used because he didn't sleep well, and he understood with cold and specific clarity that the shape of his daily life had become a weapon aimed at him. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. 12 floors down, his phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't know, a new one, not the ones Lena had used before, and it said only, "Don't go to your car." Cassian stopped on the landing between floors 8 and 7. He stood very still and listened to the building's ambient sounds and thought about Petra's 3 people and about the east corridor and about the particular silence of a stairwell where the acoustics were wrong, where the sounds from the floors above and below weren't quite landing the way they should. Thought about the second exit. He turned and went back up 3 floors, so found the service corridor and walked it to the freight elevator and rode it to the parking sublevel's far end. And when he came out, he did not go to his car. He went to the service entrance at the sublevel's north wall and came out into the narrow access lane behind the building. And a vehicle was waiting there. Black, different plates than anything he owned, and the window came down. The man behind the wheel was someone Cassian had never seen. Young, composed, wearing the particular blank expression of a professional who was paid to not have opinions. "Mr. Rourke," he said. "Miss Vale sends her regards." Cassian looked at the vehicle. He looked at the narrow lane. He thought about every decision he had made in the past 18 hours, and about the decisions waiting for him in the next 10 days, and he thought about the 23rd, and about what Petra had just told him, and about what it meant that Lena had known to send a car to this exact service entrance before he had decided to use it. The vehicle pulled out into the city, and Cassian sat in the back seat and watched lights go by, and the driver didn't speak. And Cassian didn't ask where they were going, because in this particular moment, at this particular point, he had run out of ground. Marcus knew his patterns. Seston's people had his routines. His own network had been compromised from inside by the man he trusted most. His legal exposure was 10 days from detonating, and the only person in his world who had a clear picture of the full architecture of the threat against him was the woman he had signed away at 11:47 the previous night. Whatever came next, it wasn't coming from a position of strength. It wasn't coming from control. It was coming from the specific and humbling position of a man who had been outmaneuvered at every level for 14 months by people who understood his vulnerabilities better than he did, and who had survived this long only because one quiet, invisible woman had been, without his knowledge or his gratitude, standing between him and the ground. The city moved past the windows. Cassian looked at his own hands in the dark of the vehicle, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know what came next. And then his phone buzzed one final time. A message from Petra's emergency line. 3 words that landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. They took her. Cassian read the 3 words again. They took her. He read them a second time, as if the second reading might produce a different meaning, and it didn't, and he looked up at the back of the driver's head and said, "Stop the car." The driver pulled to the curb immediately. No questions, no hesitation. These were Marlo-trained people. They didn't ask for explanations. Cassian called Petra. She answered before the first ring completed. "Talk to me. 20 minutes ago." Her voice was stripped down to pure information, all the professional evenness gone, replaced by something tight and effortful. 3 vehicles. They took her from the parking structure on Clement Street. She was alone. No security. How do you know it was her? Because one of the Marlo people who's been running surveillance on my building called it in. A breath. They followed the vehicles for 6 blocks before they lost them at the Keswick underpass. Cassian's hand on the phone was very steady. The rest of him was not. Seston's people. The plates traced to a leasing company that dissolved 8 months ago. Same pattern as the Mercer vehicles from 2 years back. Seston's signature. Another breath. Cassian. If they have her, they have leverage you cannot. This changes everything about the timeline. He knew that. He knew it in a way that went below thought, that registered in the body, before the brain caught up a cold, spreading knowledge that the 10 days he'd believed he had were already gone, that the 23rd was no longer the operative date, that the schedule he had been working against had just been rewritten by people who had decided not to wait. "Does Marcus know she was taken?" he said. A pause. He couldn't have orchestrated it without knowing. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "I don't know. I don't know if he was told before or after, or if he was the one who gave the signal." Cassian looked out the window at the wet street. A man was walking a dog. A woman was closing a shop's metal shutter, with the practiced motion of someone who did it every night without thinking. The city at 8:15 on a Thursday. Entirely ordinary. Entirely indifferent. "Get me an address," he said. "Anything from the Keswick footage. Anything from the Marlo surveillance before they lost the vehicles. Anything at all. I'm already looking." He ended the call. He sat in the back of the car and he did something he rarely did, which was let himself feel the full weight of a situation without immediately converting it into action. He let himself feel it because he needed to understand it clearly, and you couldn't understand something you were running from. Lena had been taken because they knew what she was doing. 6 weeks of dismantling Seston's manufactured evidence. 6 weeks of working through the architecture of the frame being built around Cassian's name. And somewhere in those 6 weeks, she had moved in a direction that had made her visible. She had been invisible for 6 years inside his own house. She had been invisible for 6 weeks while she worked against people who were specifically looking for her. Something she had done in the last few days had given her away. He thought about the calls, the disposable numbers. Car sent to the service entrance before he'd decided to use it. She had been careful. She had been more careful than anyone he had ever worked with. But she had been working alone. He got out of the car. The driver looked back at him, questioning. "Wait here," Cassian said, and walked 20 feet up the sidewalk and stood under the awning of the closed shop and called the only number he could think of that might have a faster answer than Petra. It rang 7 times. He was preparing for voicemail when the line connected, and a voice came through. That old and dry, and carried the specific weight of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "Mr. Rourke," Emilio Marlo said, like he'd been expecting the call, like he'd been sitting with a drink in a well-lit room waiting for Cassian's particular number to appear on his phone. "You know," Cassian said. "I know," Emilio said. "Then you know where." A pause. The pause of a man deciding how much to give and in what order. "My people tracked the vehicles to a warehouse district off the Meridian Industrial Corridor. Pier 19 or 20, the imagery isn't clear enough to confirm the specific building." Another pause. "Mr. Rourke, my niece, made a choice when she married you. She made another choice when she began protecting your operation without your knowledge. She made a third choice 6 weeks ago when she decided to dismantle what Seston built, rather than simply walk away from it. The old voice was steady, unhurried, but there was something underneath it that Cassian identified after a moment as the particular anger of a man who loves someone and has watched that person choose danger. Those were her choices to make. But I want you to understand what you're asking when you call me. I'm not asking you to go in, Cassian said. No, I'm asking you to be ready. He paused. There's a difference. A silence. Longer than the previous ones. You're going in yourself. She's there because of me, Cassian said. Because of my organization, my failures, my man. I'm not sending someone else. Another silence. Then Pier 19. The eastern loading entrance is unmanned after 8. My people will be at the perimeter. The voice paused one final time. Don't make her choices mean nothing, Mr. Rourke. Call ended. Cassian stood under the awning and looked at the wet street and thought about everything Emilio Marlo had just told him, including the things the old man hadn't said aloud. Then he walked back to the car, got in, and told the driver where to go. He went to Marcus first. It was the wrong move tactically, and he knew it was the wrong move, and he made it anyway, because there are decisions that aren't tactical, that are about something else entirely. And this was one of them. Marcus lived in a building 12 minutes from the Rourke Tower, a clean, modern building with good security that Cassian had always taken as evidence of a man who was careful about his own safety. He understood now that it was evidence of a man who expected, eventually, to need it. He had the driver wait 2 blocks out. He went up alone, used the emergency access code that Marcus didn't know Cassian had for the building's secondary entrance, took the stairs to the 9th floor, and knocked on Marcus Vane's door at 8:44 in the evening. Marcus opened it with the face of a man who had been home for 90 minutes and was on his second drink. And when he saw Cassian, Face did something that was very quick and very informative, and then settled into the practiced composure that Cassian had spent 11 years reading as trustworthiness. Cassian's steady voice. I wasn't expecting come in. I'll stay here, Cassian said. Something crossed Marcus's eyes. Okay. He leaned against the doorframe, loose-shouldered, relaxed, a performance of comfort. What's going on? Lena Vale was taken off Clement Street 40 minutes ago, Cassian said. 3 vehicles. Seston's people. Marcus's face did the right thing, the right amount of alarm, the right amount of concern, the right furrow between the brows. Cassian watched it happen and thought, 11 years. 11 years of watching this man's face and believing what he saw there. That's do we know where? Stop, Cassian said. Marcus stopped. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Cassian looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at him, and the performance was still running. Cassian could see it running. Could see the maintenance of it in the small muscles, around Marcus's eyes, the deliberate looseness of his posture, and then Cassian said, Cole drew it and watched what happened. What happened was nothing. That was the tell. A man who didn't know the name would have reacted to it, confusion. A question, the small involuntary readjustment of a face encountering new information. Marcus produced none of that. He produced a perfect stillness that was itself a reaction. I don't know that name, Marcus said. The account at Meridian Bancorp registered to a Cole Druitt that you've been feeding 4 to 6% of our distributions into for 14 months, Cassian said. You know the name? The composure held for another 4 seconds. Cassian counted them. He watched. Marcus watched the decision process move across the man's face like weather, and then Marcus straightened up from the doorframe, and the performance dropped. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that had been expensive to maintain and was now being set down. How long have you known? Marcus said. Long enough. That's not an answer. Neither are the numbers you brought me this afternoon. Marcus looked at him. His eyes were different, without the performance harder, more direct, and tired in a way that Cassian hadn't seen before. The tiredness of a man who has been holding a particular tension for a very long time. What do you want from me right now? Where is she? I don't have that information. Cassian stepped forward. He was inside the doorframe now, in Marcus's space, close enough to see the specific quality of the tiredness in his former right hand's face. Marcus, I have 14 months of transaction records, 3 witnesses, a direct line to the offshore accounts, and Petra has been compiling everything for 6 hours. I can end your life as a free man with a phone call." He paused. "Or you can tell me where she is, and I will give you 8 hours to be somewhere else before I make that call." Searched his face. Marcus searched his face. Looking for the lie, Cassian knew. Because Marcus had spent 11 years learning to read him, the same way Cassian had spent 11 years learning to read Marcus. It was the particular intimacy of betrayal you knew each other that well. Had to, because the knowing was what made the betrayal possible, and the knowing was also what made moments like this unbearable. "Pier 19, Marcus said. "Eastern side of the Meridian Corridor." Cassian had already known that. What he'd needed was confirmation, and what he'd needed more than confirmation was to look at the man who had engineered this, and let Marcus see that he was looking. "Why?" A pause. "Seston offered something you couldn't." "What?" Marcus looked at the floor. "Out." He said it quietly. "He offered me out. 12 years of this, and I wanted out, Cassian. Real out. New country, new name, enough money to not look behind me." He looked up. "You were never going to let that happen." "Not willingly." Cassian stood very still. Thought about 12 years, and about what it cost to be the second in an organelle's name, in an organization built around someone's name, for Marcus Vane. He was not going to feel compassion for Marcus Vane, but he understood the arithmetic of it in a way that was almost worse than not understanding. 8 hours, Cassian said. He walked back to the elevator and wrote it down and came out into the night air and felt it hit his face, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking back toward the driver. His phone was ringing. "Petra," he answered. "I found something," she said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has discovered something they weren't looking for and wishes they hadn't. "In the archive, the complete file." A breath. "Cassian. The 4th document, the one that connects you to the Mercer incident. I found the source. Tell me." "It's not manufactured," she said. "It's real. The Mercer connection, the way it's documented, it's a real record. Someone gave Seston an actual document." Cassian stopped walking. "That's not possible. I wasn't involved in Mercer." "I know you weren't involved, but someone in your organization was, and the documentation names you as the authorizing party, and the signature." Her voice caught, which Petra's voice never did. "The signature is yours. It's been verified. It's your actual signature on a document you never signed." "How?" "It was lifted from legitimate transaction record and transferred digitally. Technique is, it's sophisticated. This isn't Seston's in-house work. This came from someone who has your actual signature archive." A pause that felt terrible. Someone who had access to every document you signed in the last 6 years. The sidewalk was the same sidewalk. The night air was the same night air. Cassian stood in it and let the implication arrive and settle and arrange itself into its true shape. "Lena," he said, and stopped, and said it again differently. "Not Lena." "No," Petra said quickly. "Not Lena, she had access, but no." The metadata on the document transfer traces to a workstation in the east wing of your building. Room 417. A pause. "That's your personal archive room, Cassian. Access is logged. There are only 4 people with access codes. Marcus and 3 others. 2 of them have been out of the country for the past month." A breath. "The 3rd is someone who has had access for 2 years, and whose access you personally authorized, and whose name I am looking at right now, and—" "Say it, Petra." A silence. The specific silence of a person about to say something that changes the geometry of a situation. "Daniel Rourke," she said. "Your brother." The car ride to the Meridian Corridor took 19 minutes, and Cassian sat in the back and did not move for most of it. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and processed what Petra had said in the way you process something that is structurally incompatible with your existing understanding of the world. Slowly, with resistance, with the particular internal violence of having to dismantle something to make room for a truth that doesn't fit. Daniel, his younger brother by 6 years, the one who had come into the organization at Cassian's invitation, who had been given a legitimate role in the business management side, who had been in that building for 2 years with access to the archive because Cassian had trusted family the same way. You trust structural walls completely and without examination. He called Petra back from the car. Where is Daniel now? His building. He's been home since 6:30, according to his building's security log. Staying? He hasn't moved. Put someone on him. Not Marcus's people, anyone Marcus has had contact with in the last 6 months. They're compromised. Use the external team, the one off the books. Already called, Petra said. Cassian. Does Daniel know about the 23rd? About what Seston is planning? Thought about that. About Daniel's signatures on the document access log. About 2 years of a brother in the building, at family dinners, at the occasional operational meeting, where certain things were said in certain company. I don't know, he said. And that's the problem. There's another problem. There's always another problem. The 4th document, even with the metadata I've found, even with the proof that the signature was transferred from a legitimate record, without the original source document to compare against, it's going to take time to prove it in any forum that matters. And if Seston uses it before we can counter it, he'll use it when Lena tells him to, Cassian said. He heard his own voice say it and understood it, as he said it, the logic of it assembling in real time. She was taken because she was close to the archive. If she had it, if she found it, and was working on it, they took her to stop her and to take whatever she'd already compiled. A pause. How much had she found? I don't know what she had. I don't know what they found on her when they took her. Car was slowing. Through the window, the city had changed character, less residential, more industrial. The specific gray and concrete landscape of the waterfront corridor with its warehouses and loading of them docks, and the dark smell of the river cutting through everything. Cassian could see the pier structures in the distance, numbered markers on the dock faces, lit by working lights that threw hard shadows. I'm at the corridor, he said. Get me everything you find on Daniel in the next 2 hours and don't contact me on this line. Use the relay. He ended the call. He told the driver to stop 3 blocks from the pier. He got out. The night air here smelled like salt and diesel and cold concrete, and the sounds were different, the water. The distant mechanical rhythm of something industrial, running on a night shift, somewhere to the south. The wind moving through the overhead cable structures, along the dockside. Cassian walked toward Pier 19 with his hands at his sides, and his footsteps deliberate and quiet. And somewhere in the darkness to his left he was aware, without seeing them, of the Marlo perimeter Emilio had told him would be there. He didn't look for them. You didn't look for them if you could find them. They weren't doing their job. He reached the eastern loading entrance. It was unmanned, as Emilio had said. A heavy steel door. Industrial, the kind designed for freight access, and it was ajar by 4 inches, which was either careless or deliberate, and Cassian decided it didn't matter which, and went through. Inside was dark. Not completely. There was light from somewhere deeper in the structure. Yellowish working light that cast long shadows between the stack of empty pallets and obsolete equipment that filled the outer section of the warehouse floor, cold and damp, and smelled like old machinery. He heard voices before he saw anyone. 2 male voices talking low, somewhere beyond the pallet stacks. He moved through the shadows, careful with his feet on the concrete, until he reached the edge of the stacked pallets and could see into the main floor. There were 6 people that he could see. 4 of them were positioned at intervals that told him they were security, told him by the way they held their bodies and their eyes, the specific alertness of professionals who were waiting rather than working. The other 2 were standing near a portable work light, set up on a folding table, and one of them Cassian didn't recognize, mid-40s, heavy set, a man who carried weight the way powerful men carry it, like it was incidental, and the other one made Cassian's chest go cold in a way that the entire evening hadn't managed until this exact moment. Daniel Rourke stood next to the portable light with his arms crossed, and his expression, the expression of a man who was not a captive but a participant, and he was talking to the heavy-set man with the easy conversational posture of someone who was comfortable in the room, who belonged there, and who had been there long enough to be comfortable. Cassian stood very still in the shadow of the pallets. His brother was in the room. Not as a hostage, not as an accidental presence, not as anything that Cassian's mind could immediately reconstruct into something that made less damage. Daniel was in the room, and he was standing next to a man whose profile Cassian recognized from Petra's surveillance photographs as Jerome Seston, and he was not restrained, and he was not afraid, and the conversation between them had the rhythm of two people who had been talking for a while. Lena was across the floor. She was seated in a metal chair with her wrists zip-tied to its arms, and she was upright, and her face was. He couldn't read her face from this distance, couldn't see it clearly enough in the working light, but her posture was not collapsed. She was not broken. She was sitting in that way. She had that particular composed stillness that he had spent 6 years reading as passivity and was now understanding as something else entirely. He was watching Daniel talk to Seston. And even from across the warehouse floor, in bad light, at distance, Cassian could see that she was not surprised. That was the worst of it. Lena was looking at his brother standing beside Jerome Seston, and she was not surprised. And Cassian understood that she had known, or suspected, and she hadn't told him, not because she was protecting Daniel, but she hadn't been certain. And in her particular moral architecture, you did not move on a person, any person, without being certain. She had needed the archive. She had been going for the archive on Clement Street. Daniel had known she was going for it. Cassian's hand found his phone. He typed a single word to Petra Daniel and sent it, and put the phone away, and looked at his brother in the working light, and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have a name for, something that wasn't grief and wasn't rage. That was some compound of both that had no clean edges and didn't resolve neatly, and was simply going to have to be carried. Stepped out from the shadow of the pallets. "Daniel," he said. Everything in the warehouse moved at once. The 4 security men turned. Jerome Seston stepped back. Lena's head came up, and he saw her face now, and her expression was a quick, complex thing, relief and alarm, and something that might have been an apology, all of it compressed into a second before her face went still again. Daniel turned last. He turned slowly, as if he needed the extra half second, and when he faced Cassian, his expression was the expression of a man who has been caught and who has, somewhere in the machinery of his reaction, already made a decision about what to do with being caught. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't collapsing. He stood in the working light, and he looked at Cassian. And there was something in his face that Cassian almost couldn't stand to look at, because it was familiar. It was the family face, the Rourke face. It was the same jaw and the same set of the eyes that Cassian saw in his own mirror, and it was completely composed. "How did you find this place?" Daniel said. "Does that matter?" "It matters to me." He glanced at Seston. Something passed between them, a question and an answer compressed into a look, and Seston's made a small gesture to his security people, a hold gesture. "Wait." Cassian looked at his brother. "Tell me how long." Daniel uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. 3 years, he said, a little over. 3 years. A year before Marcus, a year before the assets restructuring, a year before Lena had started building the protected trust. 3 years ago, Daniel had been in the organization for 1 year, trusted enough to have building access, present enough to be invisible in the way that family was always invisible, never suspected because the relationship itself was the alibi. "Why?" Cassian said. Daniel's jaw moved. "You want the answer that makes you feel better, or the real one?" "I want the real one. Because you built something and put me in it," Daniel said, and then spent 3 years making it clear, by every word and every decision and every room I was not invited into, that it was yours, and I was furniture. His voice was even not hot. That was the thing, it wasn't hot. It was settled. It had the texture of something that had been decided a long time ago and had simply been waiting for the right moment to be said. "I spent 3 years watching you run an empire. You let me orbit. And Marcus had more authority in your organization than I did. And Marcus was not your blood." The warehouse was very quiet. One of Seston's security men had his eyes moving between Cassian and the exits. The others were still, waiting on instruction that hadn't come yet. "So you gave them everything," Cassian said. "I gave myself a future," Daniel said. "Something you weren't going to give me." Cassian looked at his brother for a long moment. He looked at the familiar face in the unfamiliar light, and he understood that he was not going to get through this moment without damage that wasn't tactical, without carrying something out of this warehouse that wasn't going to resolve with the rest of it. Some things didn't resolve. Some of them you just had to carry. He looked at Jerome Seston. Seston was watching him with the cautious, calibrated attention of a man who had gotten further in this evening than he expected, and was now recalculating. Heavyset, mid-50s, with the flat, unhurried eyes of someone who had learned that patience was its own kind of pressure. "You have a document," Cassian said to him. "One you've been planning to release on the 23rd. Seston smiled. It was a careful smile, not a warm one. "I have several documents. The Mercer one is the only one that matters. The others are recoverable. I have the counter-documentation for the others." Cassian paused. "The Mercer document you can't use anymore." Seston's smile didn't waver. "And why is that?" "Because the metadata showing the signature transfer has already been submitted to 2 separate forensic services under sealed request," Cassian said. "That document surfaces anywhere, in any proceeding. The forensic analysis surfaces with it. And the analysis traces the signature transfer back to a workstation in my building." He glanced at Daniel. "That your partner accessed." It was a partial bluff. Petra had the metadata. The forensic submissions hadn't happened yet. But Seston didn't know the timeline. Seston looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Cassian. And in that exchange of looks, Cassian saw the first crack. Not in his brother's composure. Daniel was still very still, very controlled, but in the architecture of what they had built, in the relationship between them, in the specific trust that a collaboration requires. Seston was looking at Daniel the way you looked at a person who had just become a liability, and Daniel was looking at Cassian with the particular expression of someone who has spent 3 years planning for a moment and has just watched the moment become something else. "Let her go," Cassian said to Seston. "That's an interesting opening," Seston said. "It's not an opening. It's the only thing that happens next. That doesn't end with my family in this building." Seston looked at him steadily. "Your family," he said, "appears to be divided." "My family," Cassian said, and he felt the weight of the word, the specific and terrible weight of it, "has always been divided. That's my failure." He looked at Daniel when he said it. Mine, not his. Something shifted in Daniel's face. It was small and it was quick, and it was gone almost before it arrived. But Cassian saw it because he was looking, because he had spent this entire night learning to look at the things he had previously not examined by. He looked back at Seston. "Let her go. Walk away from the 23rd. I'll give you the northern distribution rights, the 3 eastern ports. Formally, in writing, legitimately transferred. You don't have to burn my organization down to get what you actually want." Seston was quiet for a moment. The offer hung in the cold warehouse air. "And Marcus Vane," Seston said. "He's compromised." "Marcus is already gone," Cassian said. "I gave him 8 hours. Generous, stupid," Cassian said. "But done." Seston looked at him for a long moment. Kind of look that was doing calculations, adding, subtracting, measuring risk against gain, weighing what a negotiation meant against what a confrontation would cost. Cassian stood in it and kept his face level and thought about the Marlo perimeter outside and about Emilio's dry voice, telling him not to make her choices mean nothing, and he waited. Seston nodded once to the man nearest Lena. The zip ties were cut. Lena stood up from the chair slowly, the way you stood up after sitting in one position under tension for an extended time, and she rotated her wrists once and walked across the warehouse floor toward Cassian. And when she reached him, she stopped and looked at him and didn't say anything for a moment. "Your brother," she said quietly. "I know. I should have told you sooner. I wasn't certain until—" "I know," he said again. "It's all right. It wasn't all right. Nothing about it was all right. But it was true, and it was theirs. And they were standing in a cold warehouse at 9:40 at night, with the pieces of a catastrophe arranged around them." And Cassian understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has lost almost everything, and is still standing, that all right was not the standard he was measuring against anymore. He looked at his brother one last time. Daniel was looking back at him with those familiar eyes and that familiar face, and the expression of a man who had made choices that were going to take a very long time to live with. And Cassian held his gaze for 3 seconds, and then turned away. He put his hand on Lena's back, lightly, just the weight of a palm, and they walked toward the eastern loading entrance together. And behind them, Jerome Seston and Daniel Rourke stood in the working light of a warehouse that smelled like machinery and river water, and Cassian did not look back. Outside, the cold air hit them both. Somewhere in the dark of the pier perimeter, the Marlo people were still there, invisible and patient, and Cassian and Lena walked through the night toward the waiting car. And Cassian's hand was still shaking slightly from everything that was still unfinished, and Lena noticed and didn't say anything, which was, he was beginning to understand, its own kind of language. The driver opened the rear door without being asked. They got in. The car pulled away from the pier. The river was dark on their left, and the city was dark ahead of them. And Lena sat beside him and said, after a long silence, "There's still the archive. The fourth document isn't neutralized. You bluffed about the forensic submission." "I know. We have maybe 72 hours before Seston recalculates and realizes you bluffed." "I know," Cassian said. "Then we need to move tonight," she said. He looked at her in the dark of the moving car. She was pale, and there was a mark on her left wrist where the zip tie had been, a red line that would bruise, and she was looking at him with those dark eyes that he was still, even now, learning to read. "Tonight," he agreed. And the city moved past the windows toward whatever came next, which was not going to be simple, and was not going to be clean, and was going to require him to become, in a very short period of time, someone he had not previously had the necessity or the willingness to be, a man who trusted a woman he had spent 6 years failing to see, and who was going to have to act on that trust completely, without reservation, before the 72 hours ran out. They were back at the Rourke building by 10:15, not the main entrance. The freight level, the same route Cassian had used to leave, because the 3 people Marcus had put on his daily patterns were still unaccounted for, and until Petra had names and locations, they were a variable. Cassian wasn't willing to absorb, came in through the service corridor with Lena beside him, and took the internal stairs to the 12th floor, where Petra was waiting in the secondary operations room, a room that appeared on no building schematic filed with the city, and that Marcus had never, to Cassian's knowledge, been told existed. Petra looked at Lena's wrist when they walked in. She didn't say anything about it. She turned to the screens and said, "I have 40 minutes of work to show you, and none of it is good." "Show us," Lena said. Petra looked at Cassian. Something passed between them, a question about authority, about who was running. "What in this room?" And Cassian said, "Show us." And that settled it. The screens were arranged in a 4-panel configuration, each one running a different data thread. Petra walked them through it with the focused economy of someone who had been doing this for hours and had stripped everything down to what mattered. First panel showed the transaction archive, 14 months of redirected funds, mapped out in clean visual lines that showed, with horrible clarity, the patience of what Marcus had built. Not a theft, a slow hemorrhage, designed to be beneath the threshold of casual detection, designed to look like variance. The second panel showed the document archive access logs, Daniel's workstation, the specific dates and times when the Mercer document's signature had been extracted and processed. The timestamps were clinical and indifferent, and they told a story that Cassian absorbed without expression, which cost him more than it would have cost to show it. The third panel was communication intercepts. Petra had been pulling from 3 external channels that Marcus had used, and the intercepts showed a timeline of coordination with Seston's operation that went back further than 14 months. It went back 19. Cassian looked at the 19-month line. He looked at it and thought about what was happening in his organization 19 months ago. What decisions were being made, what conversations were happening, in what rooms. And he found the specific meeting 20 months ago, strategy session about expansion into the northern corridor, and he understood that Marcus walked into that meeting knowing what Seston wanted, and had spent the next 2 months positioning the organization to be vulnerable to. Exactly what Seston was going to do with that knowledge. The 4th panel, Lena said. Petra pulled it up. It was different from the others, less orderly, more dense, a working document, rather than a clean data visualization. "This is what I've been able to pull on the Mercer document itself," she said. "The metadata I found shows the signature transfer, but the source file, the actual fabricated document that Seston is holding, it's in a private server. Offline. Physical storage." She paused. "At Seston's primary facility," where Cassian said. The Aldrin Building. Financial District. He owns floors 14 through 17 under a shell company called Vectis Group. Petra turned from the screens. 14 is administrative. 15 is operations. 16 is where he keeps his private archive physical servers, hard document storage. I can't access it remotely because it's air-gapped. Someone has to go in. The room was quiet for a moment. Security, Lena said. It wasn't a question. 16 and 17 are staffed around the clock. 6-man rotation on 16. Biometric entry. Petra looked between them. There's a window. Shift change at midnight is the tightest point in the rotation, a 4-minute overlap, where coverage on the east corridor drops to 2 men. But you'd need to be already inside before midnight to use it. Cassian looked at the clock on the wall. 10:22. 98 minutes, he said. To get inside a building in the financial district with biometric security and 6 armed professionals, Petra said. She said it without editorializing, just stating it. But the shape of what she was stating was not a comfortable shape. I have the biometric solution, Lena said. Both Cassian and Petra looked at her. Lena's face did not change. Seston runs Vectis Group as a legitimate financial services front. It has 17 registered clients. 2 of those clients are accounts that my family's holding company manages. I am a named signatory on those accounts. She paused. Which means my biometric data is in Seston's system. I have authorized access to floors 14 and 15, not 16, Petra said. No, but the stairwell access between 15 and 16 runs on the same biometric cluster as the floor entries. There's a 60-second window after authorized entry to 15, where the stairwell door registers as open status. She looked at Cassian. Tested it 8 months ago. The room absorbed that. Cassian looked at her, at the composed face and the bruised wrist, and the absolute evenness with which she delivered the information, and thought about 8 months ago, about what she had been doing 8 months ago, and why, about the specific patients required to test a security stairwell in a building belonging to a man who was working to destroy the person you were trying to protect, and to file that information away for a moment that might never come and might come exactly like this. You planned for this, he said. I planned for a version of this, she said. The version where I was doing it alone. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned to Petra. I need a floor plan, current security positions if you can pull them, and a clean exit route from the Aldrin building's north side. He paused. And I need you to locate the 3 people Marcus put on my patterns. Tonight. I have 2 of them, Petra said. The 3rd. Keep working on the 3rd. He was already moving toward the door. We leave at 11, Cassian. Petra's voice stopped him. He turned. She looked at him with the expression she used when she had something to say that she wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Jerome Seston is not going to honor the agreement you made at the pier. The northern distribution rights. The 23rd, he agreed, because you had leverage in that room and he needed to regroup. She paused. He's regrouping right now. I know, Cassian said. The 72 hours Lena estimated. I think it's shorter. I think it's closer to 24. He's going to realize the forensic bluff. Faster than you expect, because he has people who know document forensics, and they're going to look at what you claimed, and they're going to pull it apart. She looked at both of them. If we don't have that document destroyed by tomorrow morning, he uses it. Then we have that document destroyed by tomorrow morning, Cassian said. He walked out. Lena followed. In the corridor outside the operations room, she caught his arm not hard, just a touch, a contact, and he stopped. Your brother, she said. Quiet, direct, no preamble. What do you want to do? He stood with that question. It was not a tactical question. It was not a tactical question. She wasn't asking him for an operational decision. She was asking him something personal. Something that sat in a different register than floor plans and biometric windows and distribution rights. Something that was going to require an answer he hadn't fully formulated yet. I don't know, he said. She nodded. She released his arm. Okay. They walked to prepare for 11 o'clock. The Aldrin building at 10:58 was what financial district buildings always were. At that hour, lit from within, formally attired, projecting the specific respectability of money that had learned to dress itself in glass and clean lines. The lobby was attended by a single security desk and 2 cameras, and Lena walked through the main entrance with the unhurried confidence of a woman who belonged there, which was not a performance, but simply the truth, and Cassian came in 2 minutes behind her as a client contact whose name was in the system under a Vectis Group guest registration that Lena had accessed remotely from the car. The lobby guard looked at Cassian's ID, looked at the registration, handed the ID back. 14th floor, sir. Thank you, Cassian said. The elevator was mirrored and quiet and smelled like the particular neutral scent of buildings that spent money on their air. Cassian and Lena stood in it and didn't speak, and when the doors opened on 14, Lena went to the biometric panel at the floor's entry corridor and pressed her palm to it, and it cleared, and they were inside. 14 was administrative empty at this hour. The workstations dark, the only light the ambient glow of screensavers and the red standby lights of idle equipment. They moved through it quickly, Lena 2 steps ahead, navigating the layout with the certainty of someone who had memorized it, and they reached the stairwell door on the east wall at 11:03. Lena pressed her palm to the secondary panel. Green light. Pushed the door open. 60 seconds from now it registers closed again, she said, already moving up. They took the stairs to 16. The door at 16 had a different panel, heavier, the biometric reader larger and more complex. Lena looked at it. Cassian looked at her. He counted in his head 30 seconds since the stairwell opened. She reached into her jacket and produced a secondary device, a flat black reader, slim, the kind of hardware that didn't come from consumer markets, and held it against the biometric panel's lower edge. It interfaced with the panel's secondary authentication port, the one designed for maintenance tests. And Cassian watched the light on the panel cycle from red to amber. And this is the part I wasn't completely sure about, she said. Her voice was steady. 40 seconds. The light went green. She pushed the door. The east corridor of floor 16 was dim working lights at low power, the ambient illumination of a space that was maintained rather than actively occupied. 2 men were visible at the far end, their backs to the door, watching a monitor bank. The shift change was in 7 minutes. The corridor between the stairwell door and the archive room was 40 feet long. Cassian counted the men, counted the cameras, looked at the camera positions and found the angle gap that Petra's floor plan had identified, a 6-foot blind spot between the second and third camera positions, created by a structural column that hadn't been accounted for in the original installation. Column on the left, he said, barely breath. I see it, Lena said. They moved. The 40 feet felt considerably longer than 40 feet. Every step on the industrial carpet was a negotiation between speed and silence, and Cassian's pulse was not calm. It was doing the thing it did under real pressure, not racing but intensifying, sharpening, each beat cleaner and harder than the last. He reached the column. Lena was already there, pressed against the concrete, and she looked at him and held up 3 fingers. 3 seconds. He nodded. They moved past the column to the archive room door. The archive room had a keypad rather than a biometric panel, and Lena typed an 8-digit sequence from memory without hesitating, and the door clicked open, and they were inside. The room was cold and smelled like electronics and dry air. Rows of physical server units lined the left wall. Filing cabinets, actual physical filing cabinets, the kind that Cassian hadn't seen in an operational setting, in years lined the right. A workstation at the center of the room was in standby mode, its screen dark. Physical file or the server, Cassian said. Server. The document was created digitally and backed up to physical. We need both, or he can restore it. She was already at the server unit, reading the labels on the rack. 3rd row, 2nd unit. The naming convention matches what I found in the metadata. She looked at it. I need 4 minutes. You have 3, Cassian said, because the shift change was happening. Because in 3 minutes, the corridor outside was going to have new people in it with fresh attention. And because 3 minutes was what they had. Lena pulled a drive from her jacket and connected it to the server unit. Her hands moved fast but not frantic, the speed of someone who had rehearsed something enough that the manual steps were automatic, who had thought through this specific task in advance and was now simply executing it. Cassian watched the door 1 minute. The corridor outside was still quiet. 2 minutes, Lena said, without looking up. First deletion is done. Running the secondary wipe. Somewhere outside the archive room, a door opened. Voices the arriving shift earlier than expected, or the departing shift lingering. Cassian's hand went to the door handle and held it steady. The voices were close, and then they moved away, moving toward the monitor bank at the corridor's far end, and the sound of them receded. Done, Lena said. She pulled the drive. She was already at the filing cabinet with a master key that Cassian did not ask where she'd gotten, and she pulled the second drawer and found what she was looking for in under 30 seconds and fed it through the compact shredder that sat, improbably and conveniently, on the floor beside the cabinet. Someone shreds in here regularly, Cassian said. Seston is careful, she said. It's one of his better qualities. She shredded the last page and straightened. We need to go. They went. The corridor was different. Now 2 new faces at the monitor bank, and the previous 2 men heading for the stairwell, which meant the stairwell was about to be occupied in a way that made it unavailable. And Cassian looked at the layout in his head and looked at Lena. And she was already turning toward the west end of the corridor, toward the secondary access she had clearly also memorized. And he followed. The secondary access was a service elevator, locked, that required a key Lena did not have. She looked at it for 1 second. Cassian looked at it for 1 second. Then Cassian took the thin metal implement from his jacket pocket that was not technically a lockpick, but that functioned as one in the hands of someone who had learned the skill young and in circumstances that had required him to be very fast about it. And he worked the service elevator's manual key bypass in 40 seconds, which was not his best time, but was adequate, and the elevator came. They rode it to the building's basement service level. They came out through the loading dock at the north wall. The night air hit them cold and smelling like the city. Cassian leaned against the exterior wall for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3, just long enough to let his pulse register what had happened and begin to adjust, and then he straightened, and they walked toward the extraction point 2 blocks north where Petra had positioned a car. We got it, Lena said. She wasn't narrating it, she was confirming it for herself, running the inventory. Server deleted, physical copy destroyed. Seston finds out in the morning, Cassian said. Yes, he's going to move. Yes. She was walking steadily, her pace matching his. The bruised wrist was at her side, and she wasn't favoring it. But he saw once, the way she adjusted her hand, in a way that suggested the throb of it was present and being managed. But he has nothing actionable now. The Mercer document was the linchpin. Without it, his case against you is a collection of circumstantial financial anomalies that could have 15 explanations. He still has Marcus's groundwork, the redirected funds, which now trace back to Marcus, not to you. The documentation I've been building for 6 weeks makes that separation very clean. She glanced at him as they walked. Cassian, it's over. The leverage he had is gone. He still has Daniel, Cassian said. She was quiet for a moment. Daniel came to the pier of his own choice. Seston didn't have to bring him. Daniel was there because he wanted to see how it ended. Cassian walked. He thought about his brother in the working light of the warehouse, arm crossed, composed. Thought about 3 years, about the slowly accumulated grievance that had apparently been large enough to trade family for an exit. He thought about whether he had given his brother any reason to choose differently. He didn't arrive at a satisfying answer, and the 2 blocks to the car went by, and Petra's driver was there. And they got in, and Petra's voice came through the car's speaker before they'd traveled a block. I have the 3rd person, she said. Her voice was tight. The 3rd person Marcus was using to watch your patterns. Who? A pause. It's one of your building security supervisors. He's been on your rotation for 3 years. Another pause. In Cassian, he made a call 12 minutes ago to a number that routes through a Seston-associated relay. Car was moving through the financial district, the clean glass buildings going by on both sides, and Cassian looked at Lena, and Lena looked at him. He called before we were out of the building, Cassian said. Called 4 minutes after your biometric entry cleared. On 14, Petra said. He has a back channel into the building's security system. Lena's jaw tightened by a fraction. Seston knows we were there. Yes, Petra said. The car hit a red light. The city sat around them, indifferent, and Cassian looked through the windshield at the cross traffic and the lit storefronts and the ordinary 10-minute life of 11:15 on a Thursday, and he felt the pace of the evening shift, felt the compression of the remaining hours become something more urgent than it had already been. How fast can Seston move? Cassian said. He was already regrouping from the pier, Petra said. He knows the archive was accessed. He knows we took something, Lena said. He doesn't know yet what we deleted versus what we copied. He has to assume we have everything, which means he can't use the document, Cassian said. But he can use everything else, Lena said. The surveillance data, the organizational mapping, the financial anomalies. None of those disappeared tonight. He can't bring you down legally, but he can destabilize your operation long enough to make a physical move. Changed. The car moved. What does a physical move look like? Cassian said. He already had a sense of it, but he wanted it said aloud, wanted to hear the specific shape of it. He removes the strategic obstacle, Lena said. Flat, clinical, the same way she delivered everything. He removes you. Tonight, if he's smart, and he is smart, she looked out the window. He knows where your building is. He knows your east corridor rotation from the surveillance data Marcus collected. He knows the Thursday gap. He knows the fourth-floor kitchen. She paused. Everything Marcus spent 7 months documenting is still in Seston's possession. Cassian looked at Petra's speaker. The building. I've already called in a security posture change, Petra said. But Cassian, the supervisor who made the call, he's still in the building. I don't know who else Marcus has positioned in there. Lock the building, Cassian said. Full protocol. Send everyone home, except the people you have personally vetted. Nobody in or out until I say. Understood. And call Emilio Marlo. Beat. You want the Marlos. I want them at the building perimeter. Same as the pier. He paused. Tell Emilio that what's coming tonight is the last of it. Tell him I'll explain in person. He looked at Lena. Tell him his niece asks. There was a brief silence on the speaker, and then Petra said, yes, and the line went quiet. Car was taking them back toward the Rourke building. Cassian looked at the route, at the blocks passing, at the familiar streets, at the city he had built an empire in for 18 years, and he thought about what waited on the other end of the drive. Not a negotiation, not a documentation problem or a financial puzzle. Something simpler and more brutal than any of that. Seston was going to come. Maybe tonight, maybe before dawn. But he was going to come because the leverage was gone, and the document was gone, and the only move left to a man who had invested 19 months into positioning for control of Cassian's territory was the direct move. Seston was 60% businessman and 40%, something older and harder, and tonight the 40% was making the decisions. Cassian knew because he was built the same way. He had always known where the arithmetic ended and what lived on the other side of it. Lena, he said, yes. When this is over, the organization. He stopped, looked out the window, tried again. You know more about how it runs than I do. You've known for 3 years. I know the vulnerabilities, she said. That's different. It's not that different. She didn't answer immediately. Car turned onto the avenue that led back to the Rourke building, and the building was visible ahead, lit up, steel and glass of it against the night sky. And Cassian looked at it and thought about everything it had cost, and everything it had cost the people around him, and about whether the thing it had cost was worth what it had produced. Depends on what you want it to be, she said finally. I want it to survive tonight first, he said. Yes, she said. So do I. The car pulled up to the service entrance. They got out. The night air was colder now, the temperature dropping toward 2 in the morning, and Cassian's breath was visible for a moment, and then gone. Petra met them at the service door. Her face was the face she wore when she was holding something and hadn't decided when to deliver it. Cassian saw it immediately. What? Daniel called, she said. 10 minutes ago. He called the building's main line and asked for you. She paused. He says Seston is moving tonight. He says he has the deployment details, routes, timing, number of people. Cassian stood very still. He wants to meet, Petra said. He says he's not calling from a Seston line. He says, she stopped. He says he wants to give you the information before it happens. The 3 of them stood in the cold outside the service door. The city moved around them, distant and enormous. And somewhere in it, Seston was organizing whatever was coming. And somewhere else in it, Daniel Rourke was sitting with a phone in his hand, and whatever it was he had been sitting with all night. Cassian looked at Lena. She was looking back at him. With those eyes, he was still learning. And she didn't tell him what to do, and he understood that she wasn't going to, that this particular decision was his to make, and she knew it, and was giving him the room to make it. Where does he want to meet? Cassian said. The Carver Street parking structure, Petra said. 3rd level. He says he can be there in 15 minutes. Cassian breathed in, breathed out. The cold air moved through him, and he felt the full weight of the night behind him and the full uncertainty of what was ahead. And he thought about Daniel in the working light of the warehouse, and about what a man looked like when Cole called his brother after everything and offered information. And he thought about whether that call was genuine, and what it cost Daniel to make it, and whether it mattered that it cost him something. Tell him 20 minutes, Cassian said. Petra looked at him. You're going. I'm going, he said. Get me Seston's deployment timeline through whatever channel you have and get it fast, and have the Marlo perimeter in place before I'm back. He looked at Lena. Stay here. She looked at him. No. Lena, it's my family's protection on your building tonight, she said. I'm the one who called it in, and I'm the one Emilio will take direction from. If the situation changes, and if Seston moves while you're at Carver Street, I need to be here to coordinate. She held his gaze. That's not argument. That's division of function. He looked at her for a long moment. She was right. And they both knew she was right, and the specific and new experience of operating with someone whose judgment he trusted enough to not override was going to take some adjustment. Fine, he said. He got back in the car alone. The drive to Carver Street took 11 minutes through light, late-night traffic. The parking structure was one of those mid-city concrete mazes, 3 levels of tightly spaced columns and dim fluorescent lights, and the smell of oil and exhaust and cold concrete. Cassian went up to the 3rd level and found it empty, except for 4 parked cars and 1 figure standing near the northeast column cluster, and the figure was Daniel. He looked different from the pier. He looked smaller, somehow, which Cassian understood wasn't physical. Daniel was the same height and build he had always been, but with something in the posture, in the absence of the composure had had in the warehouse, in the particular quality of a man who has spent several hours alone with a decision and has arrived at the other end of it. Looking like the decision had cost him, Cassian parked and got out and walked to where his brother was standing. He stopped 6 feet away. They looked at each other. You came, Daniel said. I came. Daniel looked at the concrete floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his face was doing something that Cassian had not seen on it since they were children. Since the years before everything had calcified into the configuration it became. I gave Seston the archive access, he said. I gave Marcus the biometric logs on your building. I helped them build the timeline. He said it without elaborating, just placing it there, just making sure there was no version of this conversation where Cassian didn't hear it directly. I know, Cassian said. I know you know. Daniel's jaw moved. Coming tonight. I don't know the exact route, but it's the East Corridor gap, the one the guard supervisor mapped. They have 8 people. They come in through the external maintenance access, on the building's east wall, the one that bypasses your lobby security. It opens at 2:45, when the east rotation is at its thinnest. Cassian filed it. All of it. Why are you telling me? Daniel looked at him with those familiar eyes in the dim, fluorescent light. Because I watched you walk into that warehouse tonight, he said. I watched you walk in alone to get her back and offer Seston the northern routes. Not because you'd calculated it was the right trade, but because it was the only trade that got her out of that chair. He paused. I didn't expect that. You expected me to send people. I expected you to manage it from a safe position, Daniel said. That's what you always did. You managed everything from the position of the man who owned it. His voice wasn't angry. It was something more tired than anger. Tonight you didn't do that. Cassian stood in the dim light and listened to his brother, and didn't say anything. I wanted out, Daniel said. That was true. Everything I said at the pier was true. But Seston's version of out was he was never going to let me fully out. I understood that tonight, watching the pier meeting. He looked at Cassian. He was going to use what I gave him, and then he was going to make sure I was positioned as the man who betrayed his own family, so that if anything ever came apart, I was the expendable part. You were always going to be the expendable part, Cassian said. I know that now. Cassian looked at his brother. He looked at him for a long time. long enough that the ambient sounds of the parking structure filled the silence between them, the distant sound of traffic, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the drip of something from a level below. East maintenance access, Cassian said. 245. Yes, 8 people that I counted. There may be more positioned outside. Cassian nodded once. He turned toward his car. He took 3 steps and then stopped and said, without turning around, I should have found you a different door a long time ago. One that was actually yours. He paused. I know that's late. He heard his brother breathe. It's late, Daniel said. Cassian walked to the car and got in and drove back toward the building, and the clock on the dashboard read 1:49, and he had exactly 56 minutes before Jerome Seston's 8 people hit the East Maintenance access. And somewhere in those 56 minutes, everything that had been building since 11:47 the previous night was going to find its resolution, one way or another. And Cassian drove through the city in the cold, early morning and did not think about outcomes. He thought about Lena in the operations room, coordinating the Marlo perimeter with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for this for longer than anyone had known. He thought about Petra pulling the building's security architecture into a configuration that accounted for the east gap and the maintenance access and every piece of intelligence Daniel had provided. He thought about Emilio Marlo's people, in the dark outside the building, patient and invisible waiting for a signal. He thought about the fact that for the first time in 18 years, he was not the only person in this fight who understood the full shape of it. He thought about what that was worth. He pulled up to the building at 2:03, 42 minutes before the east access, and went through the service entrance, and found Lena in the operations room, with Petra and 2 Marlo lieutenants, whose names he didn't know, but whose professionalism was immediately apparent. And Lena looked at him when he came in with the question in her eyes that she didn't ask aloud. Daniel gave me the deployment, he said. East maintenance access, 245-8 minimum. One of the Marlo lieutenants, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped silver hair who carried herself with the specific gravity of someone accustomed to being the most competent person in the room, looked at the building schematic on the screen and said, "We can close the access before they reach it." "Don't close it," Lena said. Everyone looked at her. "Let them in," she said. And the way she said it made the room very quiet, because it had the quality of something that had been thought through completely. That was not improvisation. That was the endpoint of a plan she had been running in her head for a long time, and was now finally able to execute. Cassian looked at her. She looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he understood, in the way he was beginning to understand her imperfectly, with gaps, the way you learned a language by living inside it, that she was not being reckless. She was being precise. "Tell me," he said. And Lena Vale, who had spent 6 years being the quietest person in every room, who had spent 3 years dismantling threats that the man she was protecting didn't know existed, who had divorced him to draw danger away from him and walked into a warehouse chair with zip ties on her wrists, rather than compromise the plan she was running. Lena Vale looked at the schematic and began to explain exactly what she intended to do. When Jerome Seston's people came through that door, the plan Lena laid out was not complicated. That was the first thing Cassian registered, that its power was not in its complexity, but in its simplicity, in the way it used the enemy's own preparation against them, the way it turned 14 months of surveillance and pattern mapping and organizational intelligence into the precise instrument of their exposure. It was the kind of plan that could only come from someone who had spent years watching a situation from every angle, simultaneously, who had cataloged not just what people did, but why they did it and what they would do when the conditions changed. Stood at the schematic, and she talked for 8 minutes without stopping, and when she finished, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms got quiet when the people in them had just heard something that reorganized their understanding of what was possible. The silver-haired Marlo lieutenant, her name was Dara. Cassian looked at Lena with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite respect, but was a compound of both that sat in the eyes rather than the face. "The documentation feed," Dara said. "You have that ready?" "I've had it ready for 3 weeks," as Lena said. Dara nodded once, the way people nodded when they had made a decision and were done deliberating. Cassian looked at the clock. 2:17, 28 minutes. Petra, he said. Already running, Petra said. She was at her workstation, fingers moving. The feed goes live when I say. Recording to 3 separate off-site servers. Simultaneously, if any one of them is compromised, the other 2 have the complete file, and the building feeds. Isolated from the main security system. Nothing Marcus's supervisor touched can reach them. She looked up briefly. We're clean. Cassian turned to Dara. Your people are in position. Since midnight, Dara said. Nobody moves until Lena signals, Cassian said. He looked at Dara when he said it, not because he needed to establish authority, but because he needed Dara to understand that in this building tonight Lena was the one who knew where all the pieces were, and following her timing was not a courtesy. It was the difference between this working and this being a catastrophe. Dara looked at him steadily. Understood, she said. He believed her, because Dara had arrived in this building as Emilio Marlo's direct representative, and Emilio Marlo's people didn't say things they didn't mean. Lena was looking at Cassian from across the room. She did it briefly, a check, a quick assessment, and then she looked away and back to the schematic. And Cassian understood that she was doing what she did, running the inventory, confirming the moving parts, moving forward without ceremony, and he turned back to his own preparation. He spent 20 minutes going through the building's east wing with the second Marlo lieutenant, a quiet man named Primero Ace, who communicated through positioning, showing Cassian where his people were placed, where the angles of coverage overlapped, where the gaps had been intentionally left open. The maintenance access was on the ground floor of the east wall, a heavy steel door designed for equipment intake, and it was exactly as Daniel had described, and it was open in the sense that it was accessible, and it was covered in the sense that everyone who came through it would come through it into a space that Lena's plan had already accounted for. Cassian stood in the east corridor at 2:39 and looked at the maintenance door and looked at the maintenance and breathed and thought about 18 years and about one night and about the distance between them. His phone buzzed. Lena. One word, ready. He typed back ready. He moved to his position. They came at 2:47, 2 minutes later than Daniel had said, which meant either Daniel's information had been slightly imprecise, or Seston's people had done a final check before entering, and it didn't matter which, because they came, and the maintenance door opened inward, and the first man through it was moving fast and low, in the posture of a professional, entering a space he intended to control. He came in and stopped, because the space was empty. Not dark, the east corridor lights were at normal operating level, which was itself wrong, which was the first thing that would register to a professional, a building that should be in late-night, low-power mode running full corridor lights at 2:47 in the morning. The first man hesitated for half a second, and in that half second, the men behind him were still coming through the door, and then they were inside, all 8 of them, and the maintenance door swung shut behind them. There was a sound from the door, the specific mechanical sound of a secondary lock engaging. A sound that was quiet, but that every professional in the corridor heard and registered with their bodies before their minds caught up to it. Corridor was lit and empty, and the door behind them was locked. The lead man said something short and hard to the man beside him, and the formation shifted, tightening, backs going to the wall, weapons coming up to ready positions. 8 professionals in a lit corridor doing the only rational thing, which was to consolidate and assess. That was when Petra activated the feed. Every screen in the east corridor, the security monitors, the display panels at the station junctions, 3 screens that had no business being active at this hour, came alive simultaneously with the same image, corridor they were standing in, from 4 angles, live, real time. Cassian watched it from the secondary operations room, saw the men in the corridor see themselves on the screens, saw the precise moment when the lead man understood that this was not a security oversight. This was documentation. Petra, Lena said, beside Cassian. Running, Petra said. The audio feed opened. Lena's voice came through the corridor speakers, not loud, not dramatic, just clear, the same voice she used for everything. Mr. Seston sent you into this building to remove Cassian Rourke. The documentation of that attempt, including the entry through a secured maintenance access, the weapons you're carrying, and the biometric confirmation of your identities from the entry panel, which logged you all. When the door opened, his current speech transmitted to 3 separate servers and 2 attorneys. A pause, brief and deliberate. You have been recorded entering a private building with intent. Whatever Mr. Seston offered you for tonight, it is not worth what tonight is now going to cost you. In the corridor, the lead man's jaw was tight. He was doing what professionals did, running the calculation, assessing exit options, measuring what was certain against what was possible. Cassian watched his face on the monitor and saw the calculation happen in real time. The lead man lowered his weapon slightly. It was a small movement. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was the first degree of a shift, and the men around him felt it and adjusted without being told. The way trained teams adjusted, reading their leader's body. The maintenance door will open. In 60 seconds, Lena's voice said through the speakers. Leaving now is not immunity, but it is the difference between a documentation record and a physical confrontation that ends careers. Another pause. 60 seconds. Nobody in the corridor moved for the first 30 of them. Then the lead man made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and holstered his weapon. And the formation dissolved in the organized way of people standing down rather than scattering. And the maintenance door clicked open at the 60-second mark, and they went back through it, and the door closed. And the east corridor was empty. Cassian let out a breath. They're out, Reyes said through the radio, from his position at the building's exterior perimeter. Moving to vehicles. The Marlo perimeter has eyes on all of them. Recording license plates, Dara said from another channel. Recording, Petra confirmed. Cassian stood in the secondary operations room and looked at the empty corridor on the monitor and felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a confrontation that had been absorbed rather than fought, redirected rather than met with equal force, resolved through architecture and preparation rather than the blunt instrument of direct conflict. It was not what he was accustomed to. His world had always operated on a more direct principle, force met with force, pressure met with pressure. He had never considered that the most complete form of control was not the ability to overpower, but the ability to make the overpower unnecessary. That was Lena's thinking, not his. He looked at her across the room. She was watching the monitors with the expression she wore when things were proceeding according to her plan, not satisfied, not relieved, just present, tracking. She had her arms loose at her sides, and she was standing very still the way she stood when she was thinking past the current moment to what came next. Seston, Cassian said. He knows they're out, she said. He's been monitoring their comms. She looked at him. He's in his car, 2 blocks east. He doesn't come in himself, he never does. But he's close enough to direct. You know where he is. I've had someone on him since 10 o'clock. She paused. There's a decision to make. He waited. What we have right now is documentation of an attempted entry. 8 identifiable professionals. Recorded, logged, identified, leverage. She looked at the monitor. Seston can be pressured into withdrawal. He loses tonight. He loses the Mercer document. He loses the financial trail. Marcus built his case against you is gone. He could walk away. She paused again. Or, Cassian said. We use what we have to expose the full architecture. Not just tonight, everything. The 19 months of coordination, the manufactured evidence, the money movement, the identities of his internal people. We submit it to sources that can't be pressured into silence, and we end Jerome Seston as an operational entity, not just as a threat to you specifically. The room was quiet. Petra had stopped typing. Dara was still. That's a bigger move, Cassian said. Yes. It exposes more about my organization as well. Some of it, she said. The parts that have already been exposed by what Marcus and Daniel gave Seston. We'd be controlling the narrative rather than reacting to someone else's version of it. She looked at him directly. It's your organization, your decision. He looked at her for a moment. She had laid out both options with the same level of clarity. No pressure in either direction, no indication of which she preferred. She was giving him the decision. You gave someone a decision when you respected their authority over it, even when you had a view of your own. What do you think? He said. Something moved in her face. Not surprise she didn't do surprise. Not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that registered the question, and took a moment to settle into an answer. I think leverage has a shelf life, she said. Seston backed down tonight because he had no choice. If we use leverage to make him walk away, he reconstitutes in 6 months and we're back here. She paused. Think ending it ends it. Cassian nodded. End it, he said. Petra's hands went back to the keyboard. Took 4 hours. Not the dramatic, concentrated 4 hours of a crisis, but the slow, grinding 4 hours of meticulous documentation, of carefully structured file packages going to carefully selected recipients, of Lena on 2 phones, simultaneously coordinating with people Cassian had never met who existed in a layer of her life that had been running parallel to his for 6 years without his knowledge. She sat at a workstation in the secondary operations room with the focused economy of someone executing something she had planned for a long time. And Cassian stayed in the room and let her work, and did not interrupt, and watched what it looked like when someone who was very good at something did that thing at full capacity. At 4:30 in the morning, she set both phones down. It's submitted, she said. All of it. She looked at the screen in front of her for a moment. Jerome Seston is going to spend the next several months explaining himself to people he cannot buy, pressure, or outlast. His operation is going to be under scrutiny from 4 different directions simultaneously, which is 2 more than any organization can survive in that kind of condition. She turned from the screen. He won't come at you again. Not directly. He'll be too occupied managing his own collapse. And the documentation of tonight, in the hands of 2 attorneys, and an investigative journalist who has been working the financial district corruption beat for 11 years and who has impeccable source protection. She paused. The journalist was my choice. She's careful, and she's credible, and she won't name you as a source. Cassian looked at her. You know a journalist. I know a great many people, Lena said. Petra, from her workstation, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and converted it immediately into a cough. Cassian looked at her. She looked at her screen. He looked back at Lena. Marcus. His 8 hours expired 90 minutes ago, she said. I have his location from the entry log on his building. He left at 3:15 with 2 bags. He's moving. She paused. He's not your problem anymore. Where he's going, there's nothing he can build. You made sure of that. I made sure of that. The secondary operations room at 4:30 in the morning smelled like cold coffee and electronics, and the accumulated exhaustion of a very long night. Through the room's single window, the sky to the east was beginning its first indeterminate shift from black toward something slightly less than black. The specific early hour when you couldn't yet call it dawn, but the absolute dark was gone. Cassian sat down in a chair for the first time in what felt like several years. He sat and looked at his hands on the table in front of him and felt the weight of the night settling into his body, the physical weight of sustained high tension, of hours of alertness that now had nowhere to put itself, of the specific exhaustion that came not from activity but from managing fear across an extended period. Your wrist, he said. Lena looked at her left wrist. The bruise had developed fully in the hours since the warehouse, a dark band across the bone, the color of old iron. She looked at it with the mild interest of someone assessing a piece of equipment for damage. Fine. It's not fine. It looks like it hurts. Most things that matter hurt, she said. She looked at him with those eyes that he was still, even now, in the early morning quiet of the operations room after everything. Still learning. That's not philosophy. It's just true. He looked at the bruise. He looked at her. He said, I owe you a conversation that I don't have the language for yet. Quiet for a moment. You don't have to have language for it tonight. No. I want to say it now, while I still have the nerve. He stopped. Started again. I spent 6 years in a house with you, and I treated you like furniture. I don't mean I was unkind. I mean I didn't see you at all, which is worse than unkind, because at least unkind requires you to register that someone exists. He looked at the table. You built 3 years of protection around an operation I thought I was running myself. You absorbed my dismissal and used it as cover, and spent those years working in a direction that had nothing in it for you, except keeping me upright. He looked up. Why? The room was very quiet. Petra was not typing. Dara and Reyes had left an hour ago with the post-operation security team, and it was just the 3 of them. And then Petra quietly gathered her things and said she was going to check the perimeter, feeds, which was a transparent courtesy, and which Cassian and Lena both understood as such. The door closed. Lena sat with the question for a moment, not avoiding it, sitting with it the way she sat, with things, fully, without the reflexive rush to fill silence. "I married you for the same reasons you married me," she said finally. "Practical ones. My family needed the connection, and you needed the stability, and it made sense on paper, in the way that things can make sense on paper, without making sense in any other way." She paused. "But I was in the house with you for 6 years. I watched you run something imperfectly, with blind spots the size of cities, with the city's particular area, what you could see and what you couldn't. But I watched you run it with a genuine belief that it was worth building, that what you were making had a shape that justified the cost." She looked at him. "I don't know if that's true. I still don't know. But I found I couldn't watch it collapse from the inside without caring about that." "That's not why," he said. She looked at him. "You just told me what made you start," he said. "That's not why you kept going for 3 years." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the bruised wrist and turned it slightly, as if studying it from a new angle. "No," she said. "It's not." She didn't say what the rest of it was. And he didn't push, because some things were said in their own time. And this was not a night for pushing. And he was beginning to understand that the way you learned Lena Vale was not by pressing, but by being present, by making yourself the kind of person someone might eventually choose to speak to rather than around. "The organization," he said, changing the angle. "What happens to it?" "That depends on what you want it to be," she said. Same answer as the car. But this time she continued. "The financial structure I built over 3 years can support a legitimate operation, a real one. The layers I put in place to protect the assets, they work equally well to protect legitimate income. You have the infrastructure. You have the distribution network. You have relationships." She paused. "Most of what you've been doing that requires darkness could be done in the light with some restructuring." Some of it," she agreed. "No pretense, no softening. The rest you'd have to step away from, which costs you relationships and territory and probably a period of considerable difficulty while the people who benefited from those arrangements find other arrangements." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you to do it. I'm telling you it's possible." He looked at her for a long time. "Would you stay?" he said. "If I did that?" The question sat in the air between them. He had said it more directly than he intended, and he watched her register it, watched the careful face absorb it, and work through it, and he didn't take it back. "I wouldn't stay in a marriage," she said. "Not that one. That one was what it was, and it's done." She held his gaze. "But I'd stay in the work, if the work was worth doing." A pause. "And you would have to earn the rest. The other part. Earn it, actually, through what you do, not through saying the right things." "I know," he said. "That's going to take longer than you think. Probably. And you'd have to learn to see people," she said. "Not just what they represent. Not just what they're useful for. People." She said it without heat, just stating a requirement. "Starting with your brother." The word landed. Cassian looked at the table. He thought about Daniel in the parking structure, about the familiar face in the dim fluorescent light, about 3 years that had started with a grievance that was, in its kernel, not illegitimate, a younger brother placed at the edge of something built around someone else's name, visible enough to know what he was excluded from, present enough to watch the exclusion happen daily. Cassian had done that. He had built the condition and called it inclusion and had never looked at the man living inside it closely enough to see what it was actually doing. He helped them, Cassian said. It came out not as justification, but as something that needed to be said plainly, held in the space alongside everything else. "Yes," Lena said. "He gave them the archive access. He gave them information that could have it. Could have ended very badly." "Yes," she said again. Same tone. "People who are cornered make choices they can't fully take back. True of him, and it's true of you, and it's true of most of the people in this story." She paused. "What he did tonight, calling you, going to Carver Street, giving you the deployment details, he didn't have to do that. Seston would have let him walk away. He chose to call. He chose to call." Cassian sat with that particular difficulty of holding two true things simultaneously, that his brother had betrayed him, and that his brother had also, at the critical moment, chosen something else, was not a difficulty that resolved cleanly. It was going to stay difficult. It was going to require a longer reckoning than one night could provide. I don't know how to fix that, he said. You probably can't fix it, Lena said. You can only build something different from where it is now. She paused. That's also true of most of the people in this story. He looked at her. You keep saying that. Most of the people in this story. Because it's the honest frame, she said. Not heroes and villains. Just people with limited sight and long memories, trying to survive the choices they made with the information they had. She paused. Including me. He looked at her. What did you get wrong? She almost smiled. It was a small thing, brief, the smallest movement of the corner of her mouth. I should have told you about Marcus sooner. I was being careful, and I was right to be careful, but I waited too long, and it gave them time to take me. She paused. I should have told you about Daniel the moment I suspected. I protected you from the information and left you blind, and being blind is exactly how all of this started. She looked at the bruised wrist. I made the mistake I was trying to protect you from. You were protecting the plan. I was protecting myself from having to watch your face when I told you, she said, which is not the same thing, and I knew it, and I did it anyway. She looked at him steadily. So, we've both been idiots. In different ways and for different reasons, and with different consequences. But the almost smile again. Both of us. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his chest shifted, not dramatically, not operatically, just a small internal realignment. The feeling of something that has been rigid for a long time beginning, carefully and with no particular grace, to loosen. Both of us, he agreed. 2 weeks passed. They were not easy weeks. Easy wasn't the right measure. Nothing that came after a night like that could be measured against easy. But they were forward weeks, in which things happened that moved in a direction, that accumulated into a shape. Jerome Seston spent the first week responding to inquiries from sources that could not be bought, managed, or silenced. The investigative journalist published her first piece on the 10th day, careful, sourced, devastating in the quiet way of genuinely well-documented journalism. And by the end of that week, 2 of Seston's key operations were under formal scrutiny, and 3 of his senior people had sought independent legal representation, which was the specific action of people who were beginning to understand that the group interest and their individual interest had diverged. He didn't come at Cassian again, not directly, not through intermediaries. The man had become fully occupied with his own collapsing structure, and would remain so, Lena estimated, for the better part of 2 years. Marcus Vane was in another country by the time any formal process could have reached him, and Cassian had given him the 8 hours and had meant it, and had spent exactly 1 morning sitting with what that meant before putting it away. Some debts were paid in ways that weren't satisfying. That was one of them. Daniel was in the city. He had not reached out, and Cassian had not reached out, and there was a silence between them that was a silence that was not the silence of estrangement, but the silence of 2 people who understood that when they did speak, it would need to mean something, and who were each, separately, taking time to figure out what they had to say that would. Cassian started the restructuring on the 8th day. He brought in 2 people, legitimate business consultants, one of whom Lena had recommended, and one of whom he found himself, and he sat with them in the conference room where he had signed the divorce papers 2 weeks earlier, and he told them what he wanted to build and what he was willing to stop building, and what it would cost to make that transition, and he listened to their assessment without arguing, which was new for him, and which cost him something. And he took their report home and read it twice, and gave it to Lena, and asked her what she thought. She told him, specifically, analytically, without softening the parts that were hard to hear. He listened. He took notes. He made 3 decisions based on what she said, and went back to the consultants. Lena was not in the building in an official piece of assessment. She had not agreed to any title or formal role, but she was present in a different configuration than the 6 silent years had been, in a configuration that had been explicitly agreed upon between 2 people who had stopped pretending that explicit agreement was unnecessary. She came in when the work called for it. She gave her assessment when asked. She left when she was done. It was not a marriage. It was something that didn't have a name yet, and neither of them was in a hurry to name it, because the naming felt like the kind of pressure that had broken the original thing, and they were both, apparently, still learning. On the 17th day, Emilio Marlo came to the building. He came in the morning without his usual complement of people, which was itself a statement. Arriving with 2 aides rather than an entourage was Emilio's version of informality. Cassian met him in the ground floor reception room rather than the conference room upstairs, which was its own statement, and they sat across from each other at a table that was smaller than the one they would have used for formal business. Emilio looked at him for a moment without speaking. The old man had a way of using silence that wasn't aggressive. It was simply the silence of someone who had decided that most things didn't require rushing. "My niece tells me you're restructuring," he said. "I am. She tells me you've asked her to advise the process." "I have." Emilio looked at his hands on the table. They were old hands, heavy-knuckled, the hands of someone who had built things over a very long time. "She spent 6 years protecting your operation without acknowledgement." He said it without accusation, just placing it there, letting it be what it was. "I know. She spent 3 years doing specific and difficult work to prevent the collapse of something that had no reason to care about her." He paused. "She did it because she cared, despite every reason not to." His eyes came up. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me not to waste it," Cassian said. The old man looked at him for a moment. "I'm telling you that she is the most valuable person in any room she walks into, and that she has spent most of her life in rooms that didn't know that, and that if you build something around her, the way you built your last thing, putting yourself at the center and everyone else in orbit, she will leave again." He paused. "And the next time she won't look back." Cassian held the old man's gaze. "I know that," he said. Emilio looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded. Once, the conclusive nod of a man who had said what he came to say and was satisfied it had been heard. He stood. They shook hands, and Emilio's hand was dry and very strong, and the grip lasted exactly as long as it needed to. The door, Emilio paused. "She taught herself to be invisible," he said, not turning around. "Protect herself and the people she cared about. That is a skill that costs something to learn." A pause. "Cost is that people stop seeing you." He was quiet for a moment. "You see her now?" He left. Cassian stood in the reception room for a while after Emilio's car had gone. The Marlo family gathered on the 31st day. It was not the gathering of the rain-soaked night. Outside the building, not the theater of 30 vehicles and kneeling men and declarations in the dark. It was quieter than that. More practical, a working meeting, a formal one, in a conference room that Lena had selected in a building that belonged to neither her family nor Cassian's organization, but to a legitimate hotel in the city's financial district. Neutral ground, which was Lena's choice, and which told Cassian something about how she thought about the relationship between what she'd come from and what she was building now. There were 14 people in the room. Emilio's senior people, 2 of their operational leads from the Eastern Network, Lena's immediate contacts from the Marlo financial structure, and Cassian. He was the only person present who was not Marlo connected, and he was aware of that, and he sat where he'd been placed to the right of the head of the table, not at the head, and waited. Lena came in last. She came in without ceremony, the way she did. Everything walked to the head of the table, set down a folder and a phone, looked at the room. She was wearing something clean and dark, and she had done nothing different with her hair, nothing different with her presentation, and she was still the same woman who had worn the department store coat and the scuffed shoes and had signed her name under his at 11:47 p.m. on what felt like a very long time ago. The room went quiet when she sat down, not the forced quiet of people being hushed, not the silence of compliance. Quiet of people who were waiting, who had arrived at waiting naturally, who oriented toward her without being asked to and without performing it. Emilio, seated to her left, had his hands folded on the table and was looking at her with the expression of a man who had watched someone become what they were becoming and found it settled him. Lena opened the folder. "The Eastern Network restructuring," she said. "Timetable and conditions. Let me walk through the first item, and then I want to hear from each section before we move forward." She talked for 6 minutes. Then she stopped and listened. And the 14 people around the table spoke, and she responded, and she asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable. In the way that good questions were uncomfortable, they required real answers, rather than polished summaries people defaulted to in formal settings. Twice she pushed back directly on something, Marlo Sr. said, not aggressive but completely, with the specific directness of someone who had no interest in the appearance of agreement where the substance of it was absent. Both times, the person she'd pushed back on reconsidered. One of them changed their position. The other didn't, but produced a more honest version of why, which was its own kind of progress. Cassian sat to her right and watched and said little. He had been asked to attend because his organization's legitimate assets were part of the restructuring conversation, and he contributed when his specific knowledge was relevant, and the rest of the time he simply watched. He watched Lena move through a room that had once moved through her, had once occupied the same space as her, without seeing her, had once treated her as furniture, had once failed to understand that the quietest person in every room she walked into was also the clearest-eyed one. He watched the room defer to her judgment without being asked to. He watched her carry it without it changing her. At 2:30, the meeting ended. People gathered their things. Conversations fragmented into smaller ones. The room began its organized dispersal. Cassian stayed in his seat. Lena was talking to Emilio at the far end of the table, a quiet conversation, private. The old man with his hand briefly on her arm, and her face in that configuration he was still learning. The one where something personal was happening beneath the surface, and she was managing it with the composure that had cost her so much to develop. He watched Emilio say something and watched Lena's face do something brief and human in response, not quite a smile, not quite the other thing, something in between that was its own language. And then Emilio stood and walked out, and Lena stood and turned. She saw Cassian still in his seat. She walked to him. She stopped by the chair to his right. By the chair to his right, the chair that had been empty through the meeting, and she looked at him with a question in her face. That wasn't quite a question. That was closer to an assessment, close to the look she gave things when she was taking their measure. "How are you doing?" she said. It was a real question. He had learned to hear the difference. "Honestly," he said, "I'm not sure I have a word for it." She sat down. Not the chair beside him. She sat in the chair diagonally across, the one that Emilio had occupied, and she put her folder on the table and looked at him directly. "The restructuring timeline," she said. 6 months is aggressive. 12 is more realistic. You said 6 in there. I said 6 to give everyone a number to push back against. The real conversation is about 9. She looked at him. You need to know what you actually have before you can build on it. That's going to take longer than you want it to. You've already looked at it, he said. I've been looking at it for 3 years, she said. I know what's there. He looked at her. Then we start with what you know. She looked at him for a moment. Outside the conference room's glass wall, the hotel corridor moved with its ordinary traffic people going places, doing things. The ordinary populated world that continued around the specific and private world of this room, this table, these two people sitting across from each other in the aftermath of everything. We start with what I know, she said. Not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement. The beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, but had weight, had texture, had the particular solidity of things that had been tested and had not broken. Cassian looked at her. He thought about 11:07 p.m. and the divorce papers and the single manila folder and the scuffed shoes, and he thought about 30 vehicles in the rain and zip ties on a wrist and a parking structure and a warehouse, and 4 hours in the early morning, and 17 days of something slowly becoming different. He thought about what Emilio had said. You see her now. I see you, he said. He said it quietly, not as a declaration, just as a fact, as the plainest statement of the plainest truth. Lena looked at him. Her face was doing the thing it did when something reached her that she hadn't fully prepared for, the small involuntary shift that she couldn't entirely control, that showed up and was gone quickly, but not instantly, not before he saw it. That's a start, she said. Outside, the city went about its enormous indifferent life. Inside, the conference room settled into the particular quiet of two people sitting to say without the need to fill it, learning the shape of what they were going to build, taking the time it actually required, neither of them rushing toward a version of this that didn't exist yet. The afternoon light came through the glass wall and moved across the table between them, and it was ordinary light, unremarkable, the kind that fell on everything without distinction, and it fell on Lena's hands folded on the folder and on Cassian's hands on the table across from her, and neither of them moved to close the distance, and neither of them moved away. That was enough. For today, it was enough.